I know it's a bit sort of like oversubscribed, so for maybe our younger audiences who don't mind actually sitting in front on the tika, so feel free to sort of like come forward. It's probably closer to the screen. You probably can see a lot more if you're closer to the screen as well. So I'm very happy to sort of like introduce Dr. Imran Tajuddin from the National University of Singapore here with us in KL this week. I think he's up here doing some research at the National Archives. He might be able to tell us a bit about what he's doing here later on. But I was also sort of trying to sort of like use this opportunity to get him to engage with KL public as well. So just a bit of an introduction. I'm from the Visual Arts program at the University of Malaya, where I teach art history. I'm also with the Malaysia Design Archive, and very often the University of Malaya and the Malaysia Design Archive have been sort of like working together to organize a series of talks that looks really at the transnational flows of art, architecture, and visual culture across the Asia sort of like Pacific region. I think for the past few weeks we've been looking at various different sort of like aspects of this sort of like transnational flow, primarily through the Indian Ocean, looking at the Hadrami culture, and as well as popular music in sort of like Thailand as well. So tonight, this afternoon, we're going to sort of look at something a bit more sort of like older, and we're going to go back to Srivijayan sort of like past, looking at ideas of the local, the regional, and the cosmopolitan in the Straits Buddhist Melayu architecture and culture. So some of you might have already known sort of like Imran's sort of work. I don't know how many of you are aware of sort of like Imran Tajuddin's sort of work in here in KL, or is this the first time you're sort of hearing about his practice? Or, okay, I see a few sort of like nods of head in the audience. So I'm not going to sort of maybe do too much of an introduction. I'm going to just pass the mic to him and let him speak on this topic. Okay, thank you.
First of all, thank you everyone for coming this afternoon. And thank you very much to Simon and of course to our arts projects for actually allowing us to use this space. It was supposed to be upstairs. So my name is Imran, as Simon has introduced. I'm my daytime job, if you like, is at the Department of Architecture in National University of Singapore. But as you will see, my research interest, I'm a student of many other things. So this is one of the things I study, and I would characterize what I'm about to share with you as a work in progress. The first time I presented these questions was way back in 2014 for a group of friends in what is called the Reading Group in Singapore. Subsequently, I presented it 2 more times, one of which was the latest was just earlier this year at LaSalle College of the Arts in Singapore. Some of you might be familiar with the black building that is broken apart. So there I was talking specifically about comparing, because there was an art exhibition going on there. So it's quite poetic that we actually returned to a gallery. It's a little bit unexpected. But at the LaSalle College of the Arts, my talk earlier this year was to specifically compare. I was expecting that. Okay. Is it okay? Okay. It's a little bit. Okay. It's a little bit. I think it's going to have a lot of feedback. Is it too loud? Is it better now? Okay. I think this is cool. Thank you. So I was comparing specifically, I was asked rather for that talk to specifically compare Singapore and Muara Jambi, because we had at that time hosted a group of, you could call them activists, looking at the Muara Jambi site, and then they were invited to Singapore. Louder? Oh, okay. I'm so sorry. I'm afraid of the feedback. Speak louder, yeah, because there'll be like a whistling feedback. Okay, so anyway, I'll cut the story short. That was the preliminary. I think I don't want to dwell too much about it, but that was some of the background. So my first time I presented this was to look at specifically Old Kedah. So now it's kind of like a mix of different things. And as you know, there's a part 2 to this talk. And in part 2, we are going to look at the kind of social memory as well as the forgetting in the contemporary I would say Peninsular Malay context more than Sumatra. And anyway, let's start. So I just started with this slide showing all these images that we would not today associate with Malayness. I mean, look, especially in Malaysia, right? So there's this particular version of Malayness that we talk about. This particular version of Malayness that I'm talking about is going to try to be ethnographic and try to be anthropological. And so it looks at weaving, it looks at textiles, it looks at, these are material culture of another realm. And usually we shy away from talking about architecture of the Buddhist past. So I think that's one of the things that I'm trying to overcome today, and that kind of seeming disconnect. And this happens only it happens a lot more with Malay speaking groups of the peninsula and to a limited extent Sumatra than it does to the Javanese. I think the Javanese do not say they can't anyway. It's like their twin towers, their twin Petronas is Prambanan, triple towers, so they can't forget that. Whereas I guess it helps that in the Malay realm, nobody kind of recalls these forms. It's just not in our consciousness. So I start with this kind of all these images have very important positions in Malay history. It's just that we don't know them. Visually, we can't recognize them anyway. Unless some of you are, connoisseurs or something like that, or you are historians or historians of the ancient past. But I want to start with something less material, something more elusive, and that can only be captured, traces of it, and even these hints are a little bit sometimes uncertain, and we have never quite figured out whether or not this is more correct than the other account. And I'm talking about all the accounts and testimonies that we have inherited from Chinese travelers, from Arab and Persian travelers, as well as from Malays themselves. We'll come back to the Malay account at the very end, the more contemporary. Well, when I mean contemporary, actually I mean the 1600s, but the Sulalatu Salatin or Sejarah Melayu. But we're going to start with these older accounts. As you can see, late 7th century, 10th century, and Al-Biruni's is 10th, 11th century. I kind of forgot to put down the date. But what we get from all these accounts are indications of, firstly, now I'm starting with this because every time I hear popular understandings of Kedah, it seems to waver between, that must be Hindu and therefore Tamil, or something like that. Can't quite square up the fact that Malay and Hinduism could go together. But all these testimonies make it very clear that the people in these centers spoke the language that we would today in historical linguistics call Old Malay. The Chinese, I Ching particularly, and other Chinese accounts have a particular term for this. They call the Old Malay language Kunlun, and they also call the people Kunlun, and they call the 11 Cho, I Ching calls the 11 Cho, or you can translate Cho as something like port towns or something like that, as the Kunlun Chos. There are 11 of them, he says, and 3 of them are what he mentions as Melayu, Sriwijaya, and Kedah. And then he mentions 8 others, Lamuri or Ramni, that's Aceh today, and so on. So there are many others, but what unites them all, being Kunlun Cho, the 11 of them, are that they are along the Straits. Actually, not all of them. Some of them might be on the other side of the peninsula, for example, but they are united by this waterway, at least from I Ching's account. Of course, this is a mariner or a maritime travelers centric account. And then Abu Zaid and Al-Biruni talks about, now I'm just going to focus on the names that concern us today, these 3, right? So Abu Zaid does not seem to mention Melayu. Melayu is at Jambi. However, he mentions Kalah Bar. So Bar means coast. So Malabar, for example, right? There's Makbar. Makbar is Tamil coast. Malabar is the Kerala coast. And then Zanzibar or Zanzibar, as you know, is the Zanj coast. So there's another coast across the Bay of Bengal from Makbar, and that is Kalah Bar, Kedah. So these kinds of very interesting uses of terminology. And he says that Zabag, and what is Zabag? Al-Biruni clarifies much later, Zabag Islands are what the Hindus call Suvarna Dvipa. Actually, this is a bit of a difficult translation, because when you say Hindis, in Arabic, Arabo-Persian, they call Al-Hind. Al-Hind means India, actually. It doesn't mean Hindu necessarily, Al-Hind. So the Zabag is the Zabag is, or Zabaj is the Arab transliteration of Sriwijaya or Suvarnadvipa. It's definitely not Suvarnadvipa as a transliteration, but it refers to the island. So there, all of these references to place names. Sriwijaya seems to be the Arab pronunciation or Persian pronunciation of Sriwijaya. Ramni is Ramni, Lamuri, that's Aceh. Kalah is Kedah. So it's not that these places are not known to travelers, and they were known specifically for Buddhism. So just a mapping. I can't dwell too much on this, but these are the terms that appear. So Kedah would be, I don't know whether I can use the mouse here, or the cursor, yes. So Kedah, of course, would be here. That's Langkawi, actually, not Penang, I think. That's Langkawi, so Kedah would be here. And then Aceh is called Ramli or Ilamuri Desa in the famous Chola inscription at Tanjore or Tanjibur. And then Melayu is actually at the Batanghari River, Jambi, Muara Jambi site. That's one of the temple sites. Sriwijaya is at Palembang, Musi River here. And so this term, Arabic term, Zabag, and then the terms used in Sri Lankan and Tamil texts, Javaka and variants of it, as well as Varnagripa, seem to refer to both Sumatra and Java. And it seems also to the Malay Peninsula. So there was a kind of entity of a ruler that ruled over all these territories. Now, if you move slightly further forward in time, this one is the 14th century. So Nusantara, 10th century, the Javanese called this Dwipantara, the region. But we today use the term Nusantara, right? So that actually comes from the 1365 Desha Warnana or Nagara Kertagama. That is the court text of Majapahit. And so it's Majapahit, you get his name, you get... Now, I want to point out that the term Melayu was used by not only the Arab, Persian, and Chinese accounts, but also in Javanese accounts. Melayu refers to Sumatra. I think some of you already know this anyway, but this is the historical geography that the longest river in the peninsula is of course Pahang. And so the whole of the peninsula was apparently called Pahang. It was just called Pahang. Before Malacca became a major port, and then the whole peninsula was called Malacca. Right? And then the whole Straits was called Malacca. But before that, the Straits was not called Straits of Malacca because there was no Malacca yet as an important kingdom. Maybe there was a settlement, but not an important kingdom. And so the whole Straits was called Melayu. And Melayu was found not on the peninsula, but in Jambi. Melayu, Sea of Melayu. If you read Leonard Mandaya, you see him talking about the Sea of Melayu reference from an Arab account. But there you go, these are the names. And if you read the Sulalatu Salting or Sejarah Melayu, it refers to the three princes who appeared miraculously on Bukit Suntang, and they apparently went to Minangkabau, they went to Singapore, and they went Bintan in Singapore, and then one went to Nusa Negara, Tanjung Negara, or Tanjung Pura, which refers to Borneo. So there is a third cousin of the Malay coastal groups, and that one I will not cover today because that will be too much. But that's the geography and the names there. But what is interesting for me also is, sorry, I forgot to mention this. Another Javanese account which is close to our time of concern, the 1286 old Malay inscription by a Javanese king. So a Javanese king sent a statue. We will look at this statue later, the Amoga Pasha Lokeshwara, that was dispatched from where he was based, which is Singasari, like here, and sent over to the upper reaches. This is very strange because it seems that the Melayu kingdom at that time had moved to the upper reaches of the Batanghari at what is a site called Padang Roco. And so Kertanegara's, the Old Malay inscription, refers to the fact that the whole statue was sent dari, and this is Old Malay, so you can recognize the word, right? Dari Bumi Jawa ka Suwarna Bumi. So apparently the Javanese called, if the Arabs and the Indians called these regions Suwarna Dwipa, it seems the Javanese of Singhasari era called Sumatra, this particular area, Suwarna Bumi. So you can imagine the confusion, right? Which one is which? So as you know, if you go to Thailand today, the international airport is called what? Suwarna Bhumi Airport, right? Everybody wants to lay claim to it. But according to this old Malay inscription sent by the Singhasari king in 1286, Suwarna Bhumi is none other than Melayu in Jambi. But okay, so that's this geography, just a kind of introduction. And so the sites we were talking about, Melayu is here. This I chiplak from Yon Nixik. I hope he forgives me. Nobody is paying me for this, so it's fine. This is the from his Nalanda Sriwijaya Center working paper 2010, page 13. So he has this, and sorry, there's another map later I'll show you. But this particular map is very useful, except it only talks about ancient Sumatra, so I fill in the other sites. So Malacca, So you can see how actually close these places are in relation to geography. Muara Takus is often forgotten. So you always hear from the Chinese and Arab accounts reference to Sriwijaya and sometimes Melayu. And then they would go, now I Ching traveled from Guangzhou, he went down to this part. The ruler, after spending, how many years he spent there, and then he was sent by the ruler of Sriwijaya, by the Sriwijaya ruler's ship, to Melayu, and then from Melayu he was sent to Kedah. So it seems that in 671, 670s AD, these were the three primary centers for Buddhist pilgrims, and the Malays, of course, at that time were themselves Buddhist. So these were the three, and this is, you know, when you talk about 670s, this is way before the Chola attack, way before, about 400 years before, no, 300 plus years before the attack. So that was already this kind of a connection between these centers, which I find very little conversation about when we talk about Old Kedah right now. Today it's very strange. And there's also, of course, the 12th century, 11th and 12th century centers at Muara Takus, Padang Lawas. Padang Lawas actually has access to Sungai Barumun, which goes right up this way. So all these sites, although they are very far inland, that's the other point to note, they are not on the coast, they are actually very far inland. And so they are part of the hinterland ecosystem of the upriver peoples. It's not like, you know, these are temporary sojourners who just touch the coast and then flee. No. These were temples completely embedded within the hinterland of the Melayu-speaking peoples. And the hinterland, including people who today are not considered Melayu speakers. You know? So if you know, recently, what is this? We have the Orang Rawa, right? Yeah? And then the Orang Mandailing. So they, of course, come from just down here, around the letter S for Sumatra here. So they are north of Muara Takus, south of the site of Padang Lawas, right there. And of course, when they poi Kolang, when they go to the Klang Valley, they went by the river of, usually they went by the river of Siak. So Siak is not shown, this map is not that good. So Siak is the river here that goes up to Bengkalis, and Bengkalis, as you know, is opposite Malacca. But they didn't go to Malacca, they went to Klang. So these kinds of connections are something we forget. It's just across the Straits. But there are more connections beyond that. And so this old Malay, so this is why I start with this topic, because what do we mean by local? And what do we mean by regional? And what do we mean by cosmopolitan? They are all embroiled together. And in the case of Sriwijaya, like later Malay polities, it was embedded in networks that were what we today call, I don't know, global. What would you call it? You know. So there are inscriptions, and some of you would already know this, written either on behalf of the king of Sriwijaya or the inscriptions by Sriwijaya outside its core in Palembang, and these are indicated on the map. I think I did mention that. So the red ones are written in Old Malay. Now this is that I'm differentiating here between the political entity that used Old Malay, Sriwijaya and Melayu, and the existence of inscriptions in Old Malay that has nothing to do with their political conquests. There are inscriptions, there are 7 inscriptions, Maci Suhadi has written an article about this, found in Java, Old Malay. It's the language, Old Malay language found in Java. And then there is, of course, the well-known Laguna copper plate from Laguna di Bai, that's just the inland lake near Manila, which is also written in a mixture of Old Malay, Old Javanese, and Old Tagalog. So it tells us quite a number of things about, well, of course, to summarize all of this, what actually are we talking about? I could elaborate. So the purple ones, for example, are written in connection, direct connection to Sriwijaya as a political entity, including the use of initially unknown language B. Some of you might have followed this. So language B, it was realized, is the language that connects Ma'anyan. Ma'anyan is the group of the Dayaks who live inland from South Borneo. That language, now this language Ma'anyan is connected to Malagasy, which is the language found on Madagascar. So it appears that the use of this language on Sriwijaya inscriptions refers to its shipping, its direct shipping across the Indian Ocean, in what is known as the cinnamon route, the selling of cinnamon across the Indian Ocean to the East African coast. So Malagasy here, as I've written, in Madagascar, and Ma'anyan are 2 languages that are connected across the ocean, and this language appears in the Srivijayan inscriptions, at the top in fact. So it's replicated in Old Malay below, so it's bilingual. Now these are of course fantastic. I mean, they're clues about the mobility and agency of old Malay-speaking groups. In this case, together in tandem with the speakers of Old Malagasy, Old Maanyan, which seems to therefore connect the Sejarah Melayu reference to Tanjung Pura, which is Borneo, and the kingdoms, the three brothers, so-called, the miraculously appearing three brothers on Bukit Seguntang. So it seems that there are some allegorical references there. So anyway, this is entering into the esoteric, but I am showing you where Madagascar is in relation to Sriwijaya and Maanyan. It seems that the sailing would have gone across. We don't know how much earlier, but somebody, I think that was Miller, had written about claiming that this particular reference would refer to the sailing like that, this one, the cinnamon root right here, which takes spices from Java, Sumatra, basically the region, across the Indian Ocean directly to East Africa, which is then traded up north, rather than bypassing therefore the Indian coast. And I want to bring our attention to this whole question of literacy. So we earlier spoke about the Maritime Trade Agency, and I run the risk of making it sound like Malays were just these mariners, right? So they just transported Buddhist pilgrims who were Chinese and so on, right? And then they themselves were just the pilots, right? Or not pirates, pilots. So they only drove the ships, right? They were the drivers, but that means they did nothing. That's not true at all, because Old Malay was also apparently, according to Chinese references, used to write Buddhist texts. It was used to write Buddhist texts, and it specifically mentioned Kunlun language, not Sanskrit. So I Ching does say, if you want to learn Sanskrit, before you go to Madhya Desha, which is India, you can stop by Sriwijaya because they can teach you there. Right, so that's one. But at the same time, another Chinese reference mentioned that Kunlun works were written for Buddhist texts. And he also brought back to China texts written in Kunlun language from Champa. As you know, Champa is a Malayo-Polynesian speaking group on what is today Central Vietnam. So it appears that Malay was already used as that kind of language, not just a lingua franca for trade, which you see in the Laguna Copper Plate near Manila. That one was talking about debts, settling debts. So Old Malay was used for a document like that, but Old Malay seems to have been used now. The sad thing, of course, is that we don't have any surviving example of such Buddhist texts written in Malay. This is in contrast to Old Javanese. You have Sanghyang Mahayanikan, for example. There's so many Old Javanese texts on Buddhism, but not even one Buddhist text survives, except in translation. So, you know, some of you might know this also, that apparently one particular teacher of Buddhism in Sriwijaya has a student who then went on to become a great teacher in Tibet. And the Tibetan translation of this text exists, apparently translated from an original here. Now, we don't know whether the original was written in Old Malay or in Sanskrit, but it was definitely written, not here, I mean here meaning Sriwijaya in Palembang, not in Kuala Lumpur. Here. But coming back to this, so talking about literacy, so I just wanted to show share with you the fact that there are these other texts that we no longer have, but we do have these inscriptions. So this is the oldest known dated inscription. There are a few other inscriptions from Palembang from about the 7th century. It's dated to that period based on paleographic graphic grounds, the shape of the script. But this particular one is dated, and is dated in the Shaka calendar corresponding to 1st of May. So every year, 1st of May, we can celebrate, right? The oldest dated. No, I'm kidding. But 682 AD. We'll come to this point at the end, but it was discovered on the banks of a little rivulet, a branch of the Musi in Palembang called Sungai Patang, and guess what? This was only discovered in 1920. Nobody would have known that there was a boulder there with inscriptions referring to the ruler of Palembang in Old Malay at Sungai Patang, when the person who wrote Surah Al-Salatin mentioned that there is a Muara Tatang through which you can access Sungai Melayu from Palembang. So obviously, the Sulalatu Salatin, even though it's been kind of put down as semi-legendary and mythical and so on, appears to preserve a fragment of memory referring to the specific name Muaratatang, where was discovered this oldest dated in the inscription. Now, person writing in 1600s would not have known about it because people seem to have forgotten. Right? It was apparently forgotten. Because Sejarah Melayu likes to say things like, you can still see this thing today, writing for the 1600s audience. But there was no mention there about the fact that you can see this stone there today. So obviously when he was writing it, this was forgotten. But for some reason, Muaratatang, the significance remained. But also, now it's going to be a bit scattered, but it will lead on to the next point. If you read the text, it's actually using quite a number of interesting terms. So if you look at this Dapunta Hyang, now Hyang is a word used in many Malayo-Polynesian languages to refer to ancestor. So you've got Kahyangan, right? Kahyangan, Hyang, Kahyangan, tempat Hyang. Sembahyang, homage to the Hyang. Sembahyang, which is today not fallen out of favor, right? Everybody uses Salat. Right? But Sembahyang must be Sembahyang, and then you have Moyang, yeah, and so many other words. In Parahyangan, yes, there's a place of the ancestors in both Sumatra and West Java. That one, unfortunately, is not. But maybe you're right. We can try to construct on that. Apparently not. But yes, quite sure. So Dapunta is interesting because Dapunta is actually, now today it will be a bit longer. Da is what we would get in Dang, right? Dang. For example, Dangwangi. It's a title. Mpu or Pu. Pu or Mpu is used extensively in old Javanese texts as a royal title. And among the charm is still called Pu or Po. For example, Po Dharma. So Dang, Mpu or Pu. And then Nta is what survives in Malay literary language for Ayahanda, Nenda, Anakanda, the Nda, or Nta. In this case, it's written Nta. Some of the old Malay texts found on Java use Nda. So these fragments survive. I mean, that's the only thing that we see. I mean, it's so strange, right? When you write letters in Malay, you have to use Nta, right? Da, Nenda, Ayanda, Adinda, Kanda. That Da there is embedded in the Dapunta. So it's a compound title, Hyang. Nai, as you know, still is Nai today. So aborts. The Sambao. Now, Sambao is an obsolete word, but it refers to boat. Mangala is also obsolete, but it means about to embark on. Now, Siddhayatra is one of those fantastic puzzles. It seems to refer to some kind of a journey to attain magical power or knowledge. It seems to be related to the Sanskrit word Siddhi, and then Siddha also means magic, but it doesn't. Siddhi means knowledge, but Siddhayatra in that form is peculiar to the usage that exists in maritime Southeast Asia. So here is where we encounter not only the use of Old Malay in these inscriptions, rather than Sanskrit, although the script is a version of, and here again, if you listen to the paleographies and epigraphies, one particular person has argued that we do not call this Pallava, and we don't call this Brahmi. We don't call this Pallava, but instead this is already changed from what is known as Pallava. This is actually a Southern Brahmi script. So these are forms of understanding, classifying, taxonomizing that is still in progress. So people are still debating it in the specialist realms concerning, say, for example, epigraphy. But more important for us is the fact that it refers to this term Siddhayatra, which refers to kind of a journey to attain some kind of knowledge. And this is a trope that continues in Malay and Javanese texts. You know, this whole thing about going somewhere, right? Kembara or Petualangan, or one of these words that we use, dagang, anak dagang, right? So you're going somewhere else to gain knowledge. But the term sambao as well is quite interesting because if you, you can have fun looking at the rest because that's also in Old Malay, so let's see whether you can understand. You can find this actually online nowadays. It used to be, you can't find it, you can only find it if you buy that green book, you know, by Walters, the Mice and Sedes. So now you can find it online anywhere, that transliteration. But the term sambao, the Old Malay term sambao, It's also found in Old Javanese and Malagasy. So cognates, because they are all related languages, right? Sambo and Sambu. Or Malagasy, of course, is the Madagascar language. But more interestingly, it seems to have been borrowed into Khmer and Siamese to mean ocean-going ship. So just that word alone points to quite a bit. And then there's another Old Malay term, wangkang or bangka. So you have the word bangka, right? Now what's interesting about Sumatra, sorry, I'm a bit random, but you know the island here is called Bangka. Now behind there's Bengkulu, Bangkahulu. So this is Bangkahile, the obsolete name, and Bangkahulu. Very strange, right? How come? They have this very expansive maritime geographical imagination. One side Bangkahile, the other side Bangkahulu. But anyway, Bangka refers to ship, cognate with the Polynesian term waka, and it's borrowed into Old Mon. The Mon are here. Mon are the people of Torvati, so they also used to live in the valley that we today associate with Bangkok. So the Chao Phraya Valley was also a Mon-speaking region. So the Mon, the Khmer, these are their regions. This is before, of course, the migration of Thai groups from Nanchao. But anyway, that's going a bit far, but borrowed into Old Mon and first millennium Tamil texts to mean ships. So there is at least this one term that went in the opposite direction. The term for ship. I mean, that tells us quite a bit, doesn't it? And of course, there's a famous Buru shape here. I'm having a bit of fun just showing you stuff like this, you know. Of course, it here is in Java already, but there's this famous Borobudur shape and how it exists in the context of architecture that refers to vernacular built form that we would otherwise not have known if not for, were it not for the fact that Borobudur records these buildings, these building forms, including this kind of a roof, what the Minangkabau call gonjong. But it exists apparently in Java at that time. And then there was even the Borobudur ship expedition. I don't know whether any of you were aware of this when it happened in 2003, 2004. It traveled all the way across the Indian Ocean in an attempt, there is the red line, to simulate the cinnamon route to sail. And then it went further because it says that it's trying to look at the work of Hornell, which sees Africa, what he calls Indonesian influence in the instruments and some other forms of material culture in West Africa, over here. So then it's trying to kind of like prove a hypothesis that Malay and Javanese traders could have reached the other side in their ocean-going vessels. So there's all of that. But what's interesting is, to me, also the forgetting. So when, V. Nadarajan wrote that famous book on Kedah, right? He actually had an image of this and stated wrongly that this is in Sanskrit. Yeah, it has a lot of Sanskrit words, but it's actually written in Old Malay, so it's kind of forgotten. I think it's also because Malays ourselves, we don't ourselves remember these names. But what I would like to conclude with here, and this is a picture of that Laguna di Baikawi inscription, is the fact that these evidences from Southeast Asia befuddle a little bit the very famous thesis that somebody named Sheldon Pollock recently came up with. It's called the Sanskrit Cosmopolis, talking about Sanskrit as an important vehicle. Primarily, of course, as a language of the gods. So in that sense, it's undisputed because many of the terms used for religion remained in Sanskrit. But there are certain other terms, and for example here, certain other terms that are mixed in the case of Old Malay and also in Old Cham, Old Javanese, I should have added Old Khmer, because Old Khmer appeared in an inscription very early. Like Old Malay, Old Khmer and Old Javanese works, and Old Cham works for that matter, really upset the chronology suggested by Sheldon Pollock for India. Because he's talking about, in the Indian context, the use of Sanskrit as opposed to Indian vernaculars, so-called Prakrit, right, or the other languages. But it seems that in Southeast Asia, a little bit, the dynamics seem to be maybe a variation on what is surmised in Pollock's important work. So I want to bring you to another inscription, this Talang Tuo inscription in Old Malay from Palembang. This one is also dated. And it's discovered now, here again a corroborating piece of evidence for the Sulalatul Salatin's account, right? Because it keeps mentioning Bukit Seguntang. So there is in fact a Bukit Seguntang, and at the foot of the bukit was discovered this stone in 1920. Now this stone is interesting because, this inscription is interesting because Parlak here is an obsolete word that still exists in Batak and some other languages, cognate languages of the Malay-Polynesian family. language family. Parlak refers to taman, park, or garden. And this is a specifically Buddhist act of beneficence by the Sriwijaya ruler. What's interesting for me, that you have the Nda here, Parvan Nda. So here it becomes a bit strange, because you have Da. So Dang and Nda at the back seem to have like slid around, by some process of elision. And so we have Dang and then Nda. But what's interesting is when talking about setting up of this park, if you read some of the words that are used here, what do you notice? It says yang ditanam di sini. Niur, pinang, enau, rumbia dengan sebanyaknya, yang kayu boleh dimakan buahnya, tetapi at that time meant also, and also. Today it means but then. Right? Aur, buluh betong, what do you notice? So it's called Sri Kshetra, but if you went to the park, it is completely embedded in the ecological and the flora ecosystem of the mangrove swamp of Sumatra. All of the, then you know for real that this park existed, right? It's not just a grandiose statement. Because it refers to all these Nior, Pinang, Enau, Rumbia, Aur, Buluh Betong. These are all very local plants used for. And so again, what do we, this is a particular form of a Buddhist act of devotion to set up a park for the use of people who were, now you must remember Palembang was quite important as a pilgrimage center. So conceivably, this would have been benefiting the visitors as well. But to me, this is quite a fascinating, what do we call this, piece of localism, if you like, in an act that comes from a more universal religion of that time. And I also want to point out this use of the word marvangun, virya, rajin tahu di Samisrana. So every time it's blue, these are non-Sanskrit words. These are words from Old Malay. Yeah? So in talking about knowledge or acquisition of knowledge, the Malay words were used, marbangun, to build up. Right? Membangun. Marbangun virya. So virya is Sanskrit, but the Malay verb to refer to the building up of knowledge is there. Yeah? And then rajin tahu, again, these are both Malay words. Right? To be interested or maybe industrious in acquiring it or wanting to know, curiosity perhaps. We've lost this word, right? We don't use rajin tahu today, it sounds very weird, right? But apparently, Old Malay, that was used, rajin tahu. Yeah. Parawis, again, is kind of lost. Parawis means everything. Yeah. But there you go. I just want to point out to you from the linguistic perspective. So when we talk about Malay, then we're talking about Malay that is heavily Sanskritized and yet has an agency of its own. So it's a very complicated picture that I'm talking about. And also today it's even more complicated because when we talk about Malay, both sides, Indonesia and Malaysia, Singapore, jangan cakap lah, Singapore too small, we can ignore. But Malaysia and Indonesia, we ignore each other when we come to nationalistic kind of reckoning, right? Look at that. I love these two maps. So this Indonesia talking about the Malay language, right? Like yellow. And then Malaysia about bodoh lah, orange. Same thing, right? This one, right? So these are Malay speakers in green, and then Malaysia tak pala putih lah. So likewise, when Malaysia, same thing, right? Same thing what, when it's a Malaysia thing. When you do Borneo, Sabah, Sarawak, Kalimantan buat bodoh lah. So it's this kind of very strange, okay, I was half joking, but what I'm talking about is a more serious problem. And this extends all the way to even looking at Old Kedah. So when we look at Old Kedah, we ignore what happens across the Straits. Absolutely ignore. I've tried to prove to you earlier, through so many pieces of evidence, that they are absolutely interconnected. Yeah, absolutely interconnected. So it's this kind of nationalist line. I tell you, when the Dutch and the Anglo-Dutch treaty really has such deep repercussions until today. We cannot see across the divide at all. It's just not possible. Now, number two, we're going to look at Candi or temple architecture for a number of examples from Sumatra, Kedah, and Singapura. But Singapura, you'll see, will be a blank, but you'll see why. The things that we've lost are in Singapore. And then comparisons with Java, and particularly about how, even when we look at temple architecture, the seat of putting in the deities, you can discern a number of important, not just local, but also regional characteristics. So there is no way we can talk about Buddhism without first paying homage to looking at the great Buddhist monastery of Nalanda. So Nalanda Buddhist monastery looks like this. Around by about the 8th century, you get all the cloisters. It's today found in Bihar in India, and the ruins are quite fascinating. I haven't visited it, but they look really impressive to me. So there is a cluster of temples. For example, the tall structure you see there, that's the partial ruins, the ruins of a temple. And then these are the monks' cells configured into courtyard buildings with gateways. And then we have one of several other well-known monasteries, which you can kind of call university because they taught so many different forms of knowledge, not just religion. They didn't just teach theology, they would have taught what we today would understand as medicine, mathematics, and so on. So, presumably, these are also some branches of learning that would have taken place in Sriwijaya, Sumatra. And who knows, maybe Kedah, but we don't know. But this is what Paharpur looks like. So that's a conjectural reconstruction. Nobody really knows whether the top takes this particular form of the North Indian Sekhara. We don't know. This is a North Indian Sekhara form. We don't know because there's not enough to go by. One of several conjectural reconstructions. But here you see that the living quarters of the monks, the cells, are in a perimeter form. Now compare that with what you find in Southeast Asia. It's quite different. These two are Buddhist. This is not. So Prambanan is Hindu Javanese, but these two are Javanese Buddhist. So, of course, there are no cloisters for Borobudur. It seems that the monks live in the perimeter. Now, Borobudur has a few other temples associated with it, but it's too complicated now to go into that. But Sewu has all of these. But instead of being monks' cells, they are actually what in today's language the Javanese call Candi Parwara. We don't know what the Javanese called them in the past, but these Candi Parwara, sometimes numbering hundreds like this, these are all Candi Parwara, 224 in the case of Prambanan, are not to be found in the Indian case. So there's a completely new way of conceiving of temple compound in Southeast Asia compared to India. Even in the case of Buddhism, and more so when it comes to Prambanan. So I'm using the case of Java to talk about how these monuments are really cannot be fully understood just by looking at Indian precedent. So the same thing for Prambanan in the case of Hinduism. You will never find in India a temple devoted to all three of the Trimurti. It's just not done. But in Prambanan, it's done like that. So the center is Shiva and then flanked by Brahma and Vishnu. Never done before. It's very strange. So it's kind of done like in a textbook manner, rather than what Indians themselves are practicing. So it's an application of principles, but then done in its own way. We'll come to more later, but I mean, we are always astonished by the size of those monuments, Angkor Wat in particular. But can you guess what this down here is? This is actually a partial view of Muara Jambi complex to scale. This is by scale comparison. Muara Jambi is the center of the kingdom called Melayu, the kingdom that pre-existed Sriwijaya and was conquered by it as a Buddhist center. So actually, the Buddhist temple complexes spread across Melayu is a really vast landscape. It's really vast. However, of course, as you know, the temples are not that huge. Not as huge as Prambanan or Borobudur or Nalanda's temples. But it is nonetheless quite a large area covered by it. So this particular image here is not even the full extent of it. So that's the extent of the previous image, and this is a zoom in detail. So the rest of it is scattered further out. So it's a whole landscape. So just to give you a kind of image of what it meant, you know, when I Ching. But I Ching was built, well, some of these temples are built 12th century, others are 8th century. Yeah. So we don't know yet which ones would have existed at the time of I Ching's sojourn. But well, these are some, just to share with you some images from, this is an infographic from one of the Indonesian papers taken from the Pemerintahan Kabupaten, the what do you call this, the provincial authorities. So, and what it looks like. Now, later we'll compare it to Kedah, but some of the defining characteristics, the use of these red brick or laterite stone, and then makaras, there would be. Now, I guess when you look at this, it looks like a box. And then we're not quite sure how to read the form now. One particular conjectural reconstruction is that what you're looking at here is not meant to be a wall at all. Apparently, according to this particular conjecture, this was going to have been a series of steps. I don't know how true this is, to the platform above, and so this is kind of a hollow recess at the back beneath the steps, to a platform above which was another platform, and then a multi-tiered wooden roof. There's some similarities between the overall, how do I put this, the overall typological configuration of these temples and what you would find in both Java and Kedah. But in very broad typological terms only, we'll come to that. But just take note that there are these big platforms, balustrades with makaras, and temples that had superstructures that are in wood. And in the case of Candi Tinggi at Muara Jambi, another Muara Jambi example, but later than this, so this 8th century Candi Gumpung. This one is Candi Tinggi 12th century. Seems to have had these bell stupas in the Sinalian model. They're all gone now though, but the brick remains are still scattered in the vicinity. And so this is a conjectural reconstruction. You can find this in Daigoro Chihara's big survey in the Buddhist architecture in Southeast Asia. And this of course resembles very much, just like this one does, Candi Bungsu number 2. This resembles in miniature form the kind of configuration of stupas you find in Borobudur. By the time you get to these two examples, 12th century, 11th, 12th century, Borobudur is already how old? Borobudur was already there in the 8th century. So it was already an old building. Can you imagine? By the time this was built, Borobudur is already 400 years or 300 years old. I think we can't imagine this because I think we can't. What is 300 years old that we see today? I don't know. But that was how old it was. So this is like a late example, taking after in some respects an older model. But again, you see there are certain similarities in terms of Buddhist architecture, emphasizing these steep tiered bases and then the stupas, and then of course the use of red brick. And one more that we must take note of, one more element, is that there are many different buildings always found in the Melayu context, always found within, let me just show you always found within enclosures that are configured in particular ways, with gateways, most of which are gone. So it's quite important to understand that there's a gateway and then there are all these enclosures and there are different buildings inside. So it's not just one self-standing building, but buildings within a series of enclosures, some of which have survived, some have not. Right? So for example, this one you can see an enclosure. So even say when you go to Padang Lawas, which some scholars have connected to the name of Panay, a kingdom in the vicinity, actually towards the coast. So this is in the highlands. Padang Lawas is actually at the watershed of two river systems along a gap in the Barisan Range, something like Malaysia's Titiwangsa, but Sumatra has the Barisan mountains. Right? So there's one gap there, and that's the site of this. Now, if you look at this particular temple, you've got this circular top, which again conjecturally could have been the base for a stupa, but nobody really knows because there's not enough to go by. But the kind of red brick architecture of the 11th and 12th century, you can compare with some of the examples. Now, in this case, the example is later from Java. So there are examples from Java that are, in the case of Candi Jambi, also Buddhist. But clearly the ornamentation is different. Now, of course, I'm showing you all of this because something like Si Pamutung, for example, Si Pamutung is the next one. Si Pamutung is this one. Has just recently received very detailed study 3-4 years back in a volume dedicated to the site of Si Pamutung in Padang Lawas. Sorry, the volume is dedicated to Padang Lawas as a site. And a specific study by Veronique de Groot was looking specifically at the question of how much of Si Pamutung owes itself to Javanese as opposed to local. But I think some of the discussions in that paper are still kind of like in progress. That means there are tentative conclusions drawn, but the full picture is quite a complex one as more things are discovered. For that matter, even in Kedah. So whatever is compared with other sites is always based on partial, can only be partially known, as I perhaps pointed out earlier. So this is where actually it's not so much about architectural analysis, but also about the progress of archaeological finds and reconstruction, and the science of reconstruction itself. So there are all of these puzzles, but now I kind of move back to the makaras that we saw earlier and focus on a number of makaras that we found in Candi Kedah. These are very late discoveries. So for example, this is only discovered in 2011. So it's post-2000. In fact, it's post-2010 in this case. So I think the popular consciousness about these objects is not there yet. And I just bring you back to this map again because I just want to point out how near it is to where we are. So this is Muara Jambi. Muara Jambi is right here. And so, okay, maybe you don't feel it's that near. We are out here. Singapore feels nearer than to Muara Jambi. Never mind. But anyway, Melaka then. Melaka is nearer, right? Okay. Melaka. So Melaka and Kedah. I think most people have forgotten that there was a makara found at Melaka. So there has been a study already done on comparing the makaras. The conclusion drawn was that the makaras are slightly different from each other, which I'm not surprised about. But we don't yet know what context the makara in Melaka came from. We know, of course, the first ruler of Melaka was not yet Muslim when he established Melaka. Would he have, he would have most likely either him or it could have been already pre-existing. We don't know because, Melaka might not have been an empty site in the Srivijayan era. We don't know. See, there's not enough archaeological, there isn't, right, archaeological diggings in Melaka to try and ascertain the context for this makara. As far as I know, there isn't. Yeah, there have been digs for the kota. Everybody is so on about the Portuguese fort. Right? That's the only thing that captivates everybody's imagination. But this, and of course, the Sultanate era as well, we know nothing about. Now, I will come back to this later in the part 2, because if you read the Portuguese sources, the secretary of Albuquerque actually mentioned that the mosque, the royal mosque of Malacca, was built in stone blocks. And it took workers 3 days of hard work to dismantle the stone blocks, because the stone blocks were used as the foundations for Famosa, the tower. Not the gateway that we all see as, that is Porta Santiago, right? So actually the tower that is no longer there, it was the first thing built. The tower, the defense tower, used stone blocks from the royal mosque of Malacca. Now presumably that meant that the stone building, because some of these chandis are in stone, some are in brick. But he mentioned specifically, the secretary, Gaspar Correa, if I'm not wrong, he mentioned specifically that these were stone blocks, stone cubes actually, that was the translation, not brick. So apparently the mosque of Malacca was built using stone cubes. Right? And so that would have gone back to, anyway, I'm jumping the gun, we'll come back to that later. But, just the makara, and makara from Sungai Mas. So there's only 2. I know it looks like there are 3, but there's only 2. Fortunately, that's just another not so nice photograph of the same Malacca makara, now sitting lonely among pebbles in the Malacca History Museum. And then, it's like so aesthetically unpleasant. Why you put the signboard in front of the belalai? Kesian makara. Kapal tu letak tepi, so like, you can't really I'm just talking rubbish, right? But the makara of Malacca and then the makara of Kedah. This makara of Malacca is such a mystery to me. But this one is not so much a mystery anymore. I mean, it's not a mystery at all. We always make it sound like we just discovered it. But people have known about it for the longest time. It's just that in the post-independence period, there was university and historian interest from the National Museum, the University of Malaya, lecturers come with their students, although they have no archaeological background, that kind of thing. Yeah, so then, they do some tinkering with their wives, Coleridge Wales going with wife, that kind of thing. So it was back then, and then they have the prerogative to write anything they want. So at that time, the Vogue narrative was Greater India. This must have been an Indian colony. because he didn't quite know that there was this already, for hundreds of years before the Chola invasion. There was already the remains on Bujang Valley are both Buddhist and Hindu. As is the case for Palembang, actually, the upper reaches have some Hindu remains as well, Vaishnava and so on, Vishnu and so on. But I'm not going to elaborate on this, but therefore I just wanted visually for us to look at the examples of Kedah in the context of what we saw earlier. So what has been noted by people who have studied these remains is, well, what you can see yourselves, that these temples are much smaller in relation to the ones that we see elsewhere. Also, it seems that the structures are often not the mandapa and the vimana, the main, and the hall in front have a slightly different configuration than what we find in Muara Jambi. And the dating for some of the candi is also something that has to take into account what is Chola and what is pre-Chola. So all these to me are things that are still in progress, and it's quite exciting to live in these times to watch how and when the conjectural reconstructions will come out. But way back, if you go back to earlier 1960, for example, Alistair Lamb's reconstruction, so I'm talking about this one. Alistair Lamb in 1960 and 1961 published 2 articles on Candi Bukit Batu Pahat. He excavated some sites and then he published on Candi Bukit Batu Pahat in 60 and 61. And in those publications, in one particular one, he gave this conjectural reconstruction of the form. And in a way, because in Singapore as well, there are all these terraces with pillar bases. Another person named B.A.V. Peacock, where is his name? His name's somewhere here, yes. Also has written about the pillar-based architecture in Kedah. So all this there is scholarship out there already talking about these aspects of the design of Kedah architecture. And that the relationships seen at that time, Peacock was comparing it with Java and Bali more than with Singapore, because so little was recorded before it was all taken apart. Just to give a context, so the so-called Bukit Larangan, Fort Canning Hill, right, where Raffles decided to build his bungalow at the summit of it, were discovered in 1820, a series of brick terraces with pillar bases. Yeah, but unfortunately, all of it was dismantled when the British decided to change Bukit Larangan into Fort Canning. Habis everything. The other thing was from Tanjung Singapura, where there was the Singapore stone, changed into Fort Fullerton. So the stone was blown to bits. So we don't know anything anymore about. And Singapura holds a very important position because in the Sejarah Melayu, it has that place between Palembang and Malacca. Right? The Sejarah Melayu makes so much out of it. And archaeologically speaking, although John Mixing has done a lot of excavations, these are not in the nature of architectural remains. Right? Again, he has only been able to find artifacts, mobile, smaller artifacts. But the case of the Pripi casket, for example, this reliquary casket, we might not be able to call this Pripi. Pripi is what is used in the Javanese context. These are ritual deposits to mark the consecration of a temple. So it's quite interesting to read the debate between Alistair. I'm picking up the past. Wales, that's not Kale, sorry, that's a typo. Corridge Wales and Alistair Lamb, they were having a debate about whether or not this is Indian, whether it is close to Javanese examples and so on. So just presenting to you the kinds of discussions that had gone on back then. But it seems to have no kind of continuity today among Malaysian scholars. It's kind of like, it's just stood still since 1960, 61. Or maybe I'm wrong, I'd like to be proven. But I don't quite see it. It's done by others. It's done by, there's FAO in Kuala Lumpur, for example. But I think the discipline of archaeology and people interested in it, there are, of course, archaeologists working at Kedah who are Malaysians, but there's no kind of like a larger discussion as that's seen in the past among university scholars, say at UM. I don't seem to see it. Yeah. But coming back to architecture, so the kinds of temples that we see in Singapore you can't see anything, but in Kedah, and in Muara Jambi differs quite markedly from what you can reconstruct in the Javanese case. So in the Javanese case, we have a very clear picture. And the picture emerges, well, now of course there's an even older site in West Java, two sites actually, Hindu and Buddhist, using bricks. But the earliest for which we have like these kinds of more or less satisfactory full reconstructions are in Central Java rather than West Java. And so from the West Javanese, from the East Central Javanese case, the kind of stone monuments that you can see can be compared with what we see in Tamil Nadu, for example, the Mahabalipuram. So what are the main differences in the case of Tamil Nadu? The temples are monolithic. They are carved out of a single solid block of stone, you know, rock. It's carved out like that. It's sculpture in the round, basically, with cavity inside. It's really amazing. But the case of Java uses stone blocks. And then there are many other differences. If you start noticing, it has this portico in two styles, either a lean-to roof or a gable. And the gable is outward slanting. Almost to say like you're integrating a stone version of the gonjong roof. You know? So there are all these peculiar, and you know at that time the gonjong roof was not the monopoly of Minangkabau. It is depicted in Borobudur as existing in Java, apparently. So it was also found on Java and then at some point in time stopped being built in Java. So there are all these peculiarities, so making it quite plausible, the kinds of reconstructions that we are trying to do here. You know, it's quite, in the Javanese case, they were actually built in stone, even the forms that allude to wooden roofs. It's quite funny because if you think about it, it's what is done also in European, say Greek temple architecture, trying so hard when building in marble or stone to replicate wooden architecture of a sloping roof, and using, because if you use stone or marble, it's very inefficient to use column and beam, you know, that's not how you build, right? But the symbolism of the wooden precedence of Greek temple architecture is so strong that people preserve the roof shape, the dentate showing the wooden beams, and so on, right? So likewise, you know, you see a parallel operation here, this preservation of that look of wooden structures that seem to have been a precedent. Anyway, Jacques Dumassier has written about this, you know, the fact that these temples appear in the Javanese case in the 8th century already so complex and developed must mean that there must have been earlier precedents that we cannot view, and they would have most likely been built with wood. He has already spoken about this. Well, further examples of the differences that you can see between the Javanese, the earliest Javanese cases, I should just mention that the Gedung Songo temples in Central Java are Hindu, and they're Hindu. So that's why we're comparing it with other Hindu temples. Some other peculiarities, this kind of a double plinth here, not double, a double balustrade here. Some of the peculiarities, the fact that the building for the vehicle faces directly opposite rather than in some other configuration. And of course, the biggest of them all for the Hindu temple complex are already kind of, actually these come from a set of slides where I explain the elaboration of the basic cella. So today I'm not going into that kind of technical detail, but it is elaborated into 4 directions. So instead of having just one stairway, it now has 4 in all the directions and so on. And then in further elaboration, there is a circumambulation corridor with a gateway built in. You can see the gateway itself is in the form of a temple. So all of these in Javanese architecture, temple architecture at least, we find early examples already quite well established in its own style, very recognizably Central Javanese. So in the case of Central Java, we can clearly and quite confident, the art historians and architecture historians can quite confidently say that there is such a thing as a Central Javanese style, you know, for temple architecture, for sculpture, and for even iconography. So again, I refer to Jacques Dumassier, he already pointed out in the Gedung Songo and temples, you know, there's already a Hindu iconography only found on Java, not found in India. One particular way of arranging 4 deities. So all of that. So in the case of a regional interaction, the Javanese, Central Javanese form of the Garbhagriha, the main temple tower, actually refers specifically to the womb house, like a place for the deity, seems to have had some kind of a connection to what developed in Champa and in Cambodia. So you can compare earlier examples in Cambodia, and I don't know how true this is if we have more findings from Cambodia. But earlier temples from Cambodia did not take this form. Most of them would have taken this form here, this one. Quite a number, sorry. Sampo Prey Kruk, for example, in pre-Angkor Cambodia takes that form, a kind of elongated roof, rather than this tower form. So there was a conjecture that the Javanese example was quite formative to some other regional traditions. Then the Kala Makara. Now I'm showing all of this because these are examples of forms of art that appear or reappear. We don't know whether they are already in Kedah, the Kala Makara form. I don't think with the Kala I see, so we have not, I think we don't have what do you call this, an whole example, but I remember there are Makaras to be found in Kedah. So they reappear in the Islamic period later. So this Kala Makara motif, I'm just showing it to you. So Kala Makaras are used for doorways, they are used for niches, for statues. So there's can you see a little platform here on a lotus? So there's supposed to be a statue, of course, missing. And even miniature temple depictions will have the Kala Makara doorway depicted with a staircase. You see? So this one is actually showing you staircases, a series of steps into the doorway. It's actually a representation of a temple as part of carved reliefs. For example, this one as well, right? It's just depicting. So it is repeated everywhere. So Kala Makaras are also found on antefixes. So it's a Kala head here with Makaras going up inside, sheltering. It's a kind of niche, an alcove for seated Buddhas, for example. This you can compare with Tamil Nadu. It's quite different. Yeah, the temple niches for statues in Tamil Nadu is quite different. It's not the same motif, not the same set of motifs. In some cases, there are Kalas and Makaras, but they are depicted in an entirely different way. So there is a particular form of the Kala Makara. So that's why I take issue with the fact that we refer to this as Hindu and then refer to it as Hindu as though it was Indian. It seems so difficult for us to understand that there's such a thing as Hindu and Hindu that is not Indian. So in this case, this is Hindu art that is not Indian. Or rather, Makara is found in India, but not specifically like this. It seems that the problem is not so compounded when you look at Cambodia. Right now, there is an exhibition happening at the Asian Civilization Museum in Singapore on Angkor. And everywhere it's referring to it as Khmer art. It seems that for Cambodia, nobody refers to it as Hindu art or Buddhist art. It's just Khmer art. Can you believe that? So they have attained that kind of status in the global imagination that we no longer refer to Khmer Buddhist and Khmer Hindu art as Buddhist or Hindu. We just refer to it as Khmer. And I wonder how much longer it takes before Malay and Javanese Hindu and Buddhist art will just be referred to as Javanese and Malay. Malay is going to be difficult. Because Malay, betul ke ni Melayu? Macam lain je. Can you imagine? I cannot even imagine speaking to you in Malay on these things. It sounds so strange. It will take maybe another generation. I don't know. But you get what I'm saying. And so there is that shift that seems to have occurred quite early, actually, in the case of, maybe you can attribute it to the French who colonized the Cambodians, So they made it very sexy. Everything is Cambodian. And then the Dutch, alamak, Dutch. They never managed to make anything sexy. But they're very practical, I think. I don't know, I'm just joking. Please don't. I'm just trying to break I know it's a bit boring, the topic, so I'm trying to make it a bit more lighthearted. But I think the more serious point, I hope I conveyed it sufficiently. There is this mental barrier to calling this just Javanese. We keep calling it, all the old books, Indo-Javanese art, Hindu-Javanese art. Why can't you just call it like Khmer sculpture? Does it have to be Hindu and Buddhist Khmer sculpture? Now, the reason for this, the more serious reason for this, is that the Malays have converted. And so the old Hindu-Buddhist past seems un-Malay. Because you look at the Malays today, and they are no longer Hindu or Buddhist. Whereas if you look at the Khmer and the Thai, of course they are Buddhist. Why do you have to qualify? Thai is Buddhist lah, something like that. I suppose. But anyway, so these are the Javanese. This is the iconographic group I was talking about. So Shiva will be inside, and then you have Agastya, the teacher, and then Ganesha, and then the consort. Other examples. So even there is already even within the Central Javanese Kalamakara motif, there are all these variations. Some of which you can find in Champa. So, for example, in Cham art, you will be able to find this curling in, but not exactly a carbon copy. So there is this regional kind of connection as well. But I want to go on to the next point. So that was about motifs and the kind of like, okay, it is part of that larger Hindu-Buddhist world, but then so is China and so on, so, and Cambodia, and that there are certain things that are very specific to the region, and in some cases show intra-regional interaction, although I didn't quite elaborate on that. And the next point would be the fact that in Southeast Asia, we really, really have to look beyond just the temple tower, or just the brick remains or the stone remains. Because as I've shown you at the earlier slides, in Southeast Asia, the landscape is quite important. How the temple sits within a larger spatial organization that is larger than just the temple itself. How am I doing for time, Simon? I just realized.
It's about
1 hour.
20 now.
For 20, right? Okay. Just warn me when it's too long. No.
Everyone's very engrossed.
Okay. No, because I know it's a bit long, and so.
Unless you want to take it.
Oh no, it's still fine. Yeah. So in this case, Prambanan, right? We have the 6 main temples, and then even within that you have some Candi Apit and so on. But there is a first enclosure, a second enclosure, and then another third enclosure that is skewed off axis. Nobody quite knows why. Is it because it is the urban grid? None of the cities, nobody really knows why. Although there has been some reconstructions, but more importantly, I want to point out something that I think you only notice from this elevation, and that is the fact that it is actually a gigantic terraced site. You see? It's actually terraced. The whole place is terraced. And if you go to the site, you'll be able to see there is a series of steps, kind of like not a causeway, but a walkway down the center here. All of these have steps, and then we go in. So steps again. So all of these 224 temples are actually on a huge terrace plinth. And the final plinth, the tallest plinth, is this enclosure. Actually, you have to climb up quite a number of steps. And that is where we can locate, the kind of temple architecture you find in Kedah as well. All of these terraces and steps. In fact, even this is not enough because it's just the brick remain, right? Once you go further beyond this one, you also have the landscape. Again, I'm saying this is not new, okay? Alistair Lam has done this already in 1960, 1961. It's just the way we view it. We don't understand it within the regional context, So it's got terraces that, here again, it will be very useful to see it in landscape, sectional context. So it's part of this larger landscape. And the position, the siting and all that is quite important. Of course, the mother of all terraces. But I want to also talk about the fact that Borobudur, now, it's actually a literate translation, in the sense that it's not just a craft or some kind of default mode of building, because this is like a structuralist mode of thinking, right? People from this region, they will always terrace things. So by default, like automatons, when they build something, it will be terrace one. Not like that, but it was consciously reworked from the literate point of view. And what I mean is there is an engagement with Shastric sources. We call it Sastra, right? Shastric, the literature. So the inscriptions that are today, or rather that Kaspari has associated with Borobudur, refer to Bumi Sambara Budara, from which we get the folk name today, Borobudur. Not as here, let me just read it to you. The inscription of 842 AD applies to Bumi Sambara, not any of the well-known terms, or Sanskrit terms I should add, used by modern scholars to describe Borobudur. Stupa, Stupa Prasada, or Mandala. But Kamulan. Kamulan is fascinating as a term, right? Because Mula is of course Sanskrit. But the addition of the prefix and suffix, it becomes, and it refers to the place of origin, an ancestral mound. Remember the Hyang? Yeah. So then you see that it's a kind of, it's not just a default thing. It was consciously invoked. Yeah? There are many other conscious invocations in relation to this terrace form in written format. So I would like us to kind of look at this a little bit differently. You know? So these are all very conscious manifestations of a particular mode of building that emphasize these terraces in ways that seem to differ in some ways and yet have parallels in other ways with what you see in India. So it's not only not Indian or only indigenous, but that the two work in tandem, and then there was a very conscious reworking to say that this is also referring to our cults. That it also kind of has a relationship to older ways of building that predate the Indic religious conversion. Well, of course, here I would just show what actually that manifested itself in the case of Borobudur and makes it such a such a distinguished monument. The fact that it has this translation, of course, it was a result of successive renovations and reworking. You know, so it was rebuilt and then added onto. But the final monument has a kind of interesting coherence. You know, the Arupadatu, the realm. The realm of action, the realm of form, and then the realm of formlessness. So as you walk around, the base is the realm of action or deeds rather, and then you have the realm of form, where you are bombarded with images engulfing you in these terraces, and they are rectilinear. So in terms of geometry or the poetry of the geometry, you're engulfed by all these images left and right in these dense panels. And they are rectilinear, right? And reticulated rectangles. By the time you reach the top, some argue you would not have been allowed to go to the top if you were just kind of a normal devotee, laity. The top are circular, and then so the geometry changes to circles, and so at the top you suddenly have a view out to the landscape. You know? So that's sort of a poetic interpretation in the case of Borobudur. I'm kind of a little bit indulging here because I just wanted to also show, in the case of Borobudur, there are other things that are just unique to Borobudur, and the fact one of them is the fact that these life-size Buddhas are put inside perforated stupas. Never before and never since has there ever been such a monument with perforated stupas with life-size Buddhas inside. Yeah. So that's kind of like, you can't just say, oh, this is when they were Indian, the kind of thing. It's not. Okay, so even in the case of this huge monument, there was something completely original, and this originality is not because it was embedded into indigeneity. No, it was a furtherance of an Indic idea. You get what I'm saying? So there is yet another reworking. One reworking refers to the Indic, whatever you want to use, melded or reworked together with the indigenous, but it could also be that it is a reworking within that tradition, but in a way never seen in India. So this is yet another form of that. So I wonder if that kind of agency will be, seen in the case of Kedah. But I just wanted to point this out. Other forms of coming together of the indigenous traditions of building and until to such a point where you should just call this Javanese, rather than Hindu Javanese, is this particular Pundan as a Buddhist site, Ratu Boko, but how it also has certain elements that seem to bear some parallels with one of the Sri Lankan Buddhist monasteries invoked in one of the inscriptions here, or mentioned rather, not invoked, mentioned in one of the inscriptions here. So there is a conscious connection made by the Javanese themselves to a Sri Lankan monastery, but then the particular ways in which the landscaping is formed here is Javanese. Another terrace site. So showing you that terrace sites in Southeast Asian Buddhist as well as Hindu temples are quite widespread, they're quite prevalent. So the case of Kedah can be seen within that larger context. More importantly, in the case of Sambisari, there are all these, you can see what these are, right? These are pillar bases. So this is an example of a central Javanese Chandi which would have had a wooden superstructure. We don't know what kind of form it would have taken. Would it have been multi-tiered roof? Nobody really knows. But you can see this pillar-based, what Peacock would have called pillar-based architecture, I mean not would have called, what Peacock writes about, the pillar-based architecture of Kedah. Not just in Kedah, you also find it in Singapore, you also find it in Central Java. Right? This kind of, so it's not only, like I said, you have to move, you have to think beyond the masonry and beyond just the core temple to the whole landscape. So, and of course, this is going out a bit on a stretch here. Again, structuralism is not very popular now, but these are quite deep-seated understandings within the Malayo-Polynesian group to have these terraces and landscapes like that. So another temple form. So it's very, very, very common in the East Java tradition. So just now, Central Java, East Java is later in the chronology of the center for the kingdom. Comparing a Central Javanese and an East Javanese. So in the case of Java, you see a shift, although it's not so clear-cut. Even in the Central Javanese period, there was already the non-concentric form. But by and large, in Central Java, it's mostly concentric. And in the East Javanese period later, it was not concentric. It was terraced in one direction, eccentric. But not always, so there were some cases where it's not like that, but by and large. But in the case of, so this is eccentric, as you can see, there is a clear front and there is the rear, which is the main temple. Right? More similar in that sense to Kedah. So it'll be interesting to look at the kind of difference or similarity between the chronology of Java and that of Kedah. Well, and you would by now be familiar with this kind of cases, right? We saw this in Melayu just now, but in Java as well you get them. So this is at Panataran, the pillar base alone. The actual temple is reconstructed partially on the side. So if you're there, it's on the left, it's out of the picture range. But if you put it on top, then there will be a temple on top, and then there will be smaller temples on the four sides at the center of these protrusions. Jajagu has this eccentric platform bases that go up to the summit as well. So these are some of the now it's closer in connection to Sumatra than you think, because now we come to Singasari, which was a predecessor of Trowulan. So some of the temples we saw earlier, there's a distribution. Now if you go to one of the important occasions when the name Melayu re-emerges is when the Singasari ruler declared a Pamelayu expedition. So it's quite an interesting word, Pamelayu, to do the Melayu, do them in or something like that. Pamelayu, right? So Pa makes it a verb, Pamelayu. There's a running joke because in Javanese, Melayu means to run. You know, right? Melayu means to run. So maybe for the Javanese, they all laugh at this term, yeah, Melayu. I don't know. Because the Javanese and Malay rivalry, I was joking about that, but it's a real thing. I mean, of course, there's also a lot of convergences and in literary works, how the Malays really like Panji stories and so on. But there is this real moment of contestation between the two in which the Javanese prevail. So we're looking at a few examples. So this is the famous Amoga Pasha Lokesvara statue and its inscription in two parts. The front base, or the base at the front, and then the back of the statue. They were actually found separately and then they were reunited. But they are found all the way inland, because by this time it appears that the center of the Melayu kingdom had shifted far inland. Not the center, but the ruler seems to have moved upriver. So Muara Jambi would have still been there as the Buddhist site, but the ruler seems to have moved upriver. But some interesting things about this particular inscription are the references to names. So I suddenly forget, was it called Melayu Pura here or what? I have written down somewhere, but never mind. You can look it up actually. So there is a term used in this inscription referring to the name Melayu, but a particular form of the name. Here it is. Oh well, we've actually seen it just now. Dari Bumi Jawa ke Sawarna Bumi. We've already seen it just now, I've shown it to you. But anyway, so in this inscription, it refers to this area in Sumatra, upriver from Muara Jambi as Suvarnabhumi. So, we should tell Thailand, no, not we, we're not Sumatrans. What am I talking about here? But, we should tell Thais, you guys cannot use Suvarnabhumi. According to the Javanese, Suvarnabhumi is in Sumatra. But, and then this is, I'm showing you two images. So, Prajna Paramita from Candi Gumpung in Muara Jambi, unfortunately without the head, and the Prajna Paramita of Singasari. So this is the period when comparison between East Java and Sumatra becomes very has a strong basis because of these political links. But these are two very famous. Now this has a longer history of being famous because of its discovery. Early discovery, and then being brought to the Netherlands where it gained currency and fame. And whenever people talk about Hindu-Javanese art, again, they will use Hindu-Javanese art, this would be one of the key images that will be invoked as an example of the high accomplishment of the period. But there's this less well known, I think partly because there's no personality left when you lop off the head. You know what I mean? It's a little, but it's quite clearly different. So I put these examples just to say that it's not entirely true to just say that one is a derivative of the other. But these are contemporaries, and you can already tell, even though there are these obvious links between East Java, Singasari, and Melayu at the time, even the Prajna Paramita, which exists so close in time frame and depict the same deity, have such a different manifestation. There are other. Now, these I show to you only by way of making a kind of raising some questions because it's not been sufficiently discussed. Only one person, as far as I know, has tried to talk about statuary in a way that looks at it pan-regionally and tries to talk about whether we can say there is such a thing as what I wrote up there very provocatively, as though it's taken to be true. Sriwijaya Melayu sculpture. Can we really say there's such a thing? I put it up there not as a certainty but as a question. Is there a school of, because this has been questioned, this has been discussed, there were people from Thailand, because Thai royalty and aristocracy is very interested in these questions because they're Buddhist, so they're always interested in trying to define for themselves their own art, including the forms of art that existed in what is today Thailand before they were there. So they were very happy to know that Sriwijaya extended to southern Thailand, and so they tried to hook up the story that there is such thing as a Sriwijaya school of art. But in their version, Sriwijaya had its center in southern Thailand, not in Palembang, until of course the publications of the old Malay inscriptions in Palembang kind of like, you can't really say that. It's more likely down here. But, so they were among the early ones to try and define such a thing, or try and stake a claim that there's such a thing as Sriwijaya Melayu sculpture. But we don't have that kind of, when you read about these sculpture examples, you will always first be told what example in India they resemble. That's the first thing, because there's always this question of genealogy, right? But then there is not yet a comparison across the region to say, but yes, of course, but then, because it's not exactly the same. These descriptions will, in the same breath, sometimes acknowledge, but this is different. But you can see the links. Well, I've been to a talk recently in Singapore where the person was just interested in saying, this resembles that, this resembles that, this resembles that, and stops there. Unfortunately, much of the scholarship remains at that level. So we're only interested to say, this resembles that example in India. Then never even bother to say, but it's not the same. You know what I mean? It's not the same. So then what does it, what more can we say besides the fact that it resembles something in India? Of course it will resemble something in India. For that matter, all the Buddha statues in Japan, Korea, and China resemble something in India. But we don't stop there, you see. It's a real problem, don't you think? Then like that, can you imagine all the labels for every Japanese sculpture of the Buddha? This resembles the Pala art of Bengal. And it was like, okay. And then you call it Buddhist art of Japan. Not Japanese sculpture, right? I just want to keep reminding you of this. So that kind of the mental block that we have. or for that matter, these kind of colossal Buddha statues, larger than life, found in Java. It's colossal. It's in Candi Mendut. Mendut is associated with Borobudur. It's quite close. Mendut, Pawon, Borobudur at least. These three. And then we come to, okay, Singapore has two, so you guys can help clean back for Malaysia. No, I'm kidding. We have two examples from the peninsula in the Asian Civilizations Museum collection in Singapore. It's still there. So, one is from Bujang Valley. The other one, there was no. This is from John Gee's cataloging work. John Gee Guy, has written this book called Lost Kingdoms. So these are featured in there. And these, I'm just showing you what it looks like, what they look like. Sorry. Yeah. Okay. I'm going to move forward now. I was going to what I was telling you about Japan. Is actually supposed to be, or China. Supposed to be looking at this. I mean, like, would you keep saying this is derived from what tradition in India anymore? You don't. But for Southeast Asia, we still do that. And last, before we take our break, coming back to this question. Now, what is interesting about words in Malay that refer to writing? I use here two Sanskrit forms, Prashasti and Aksara. But of course, that's not the only words to refer to literacy. We have all these indigenous words. So what does that actually mean? That there are indigenous words for writing and reading. Tulis, lukis. Now, lukis was also used to write in the past. Lukis. Not just tulis. And gambar. Gambar was also used to not just making diagrams, but also writing. And the word bacha. So, what does that actually mean? And there are all these forms of books in Southeast Asia, forms of bookmaking, or forms of, some of them cannot even be called books. Like, for example, the way Long Barak script in Bugis culture is wound into that, looking like a reel. Have you seen that? It's a spoon. So, what does that actually mean? More interesting for me would be, what does that mean in that period of the Indic? Now, of course, the only kinds of writing that survives from the early period would be in our situation, unless we have a Dead Sea Scroll somewhere. Not possible. Maybe in some danau upriver in Sumatra, but as of yet, we don't know. We only have these stone inscriptions that already use versions of South Indian script. But Jean-Baptiste cautions us, that I wrote there in blue. It's not. There's not quite any direct Indian model. It has already. See, this is 2014. If you read references on this earlier in 1980s, 1990s, as I did, 2000s, it would always have been just glossed as Indian script. Okay, but here you have somebody from Guimet Museum in Paris, making this important staking this claim, okay, that it is already evolved from its Indian predecessors. That's a very bold statement for Baptiste to make, because these are among the earliest inscriptions, and for him to say that even in the 4th century, this is 400 years earlier than Borobudur. To say that this early form of writing is already, and Kutai, everybody is wondering, why Kutai? Kutai is like, tak ada benda kat sana. From, that kind of empires, right? For the longest time, people asking this, but especially Javanese, they'll be like, it's outside Java, that's interesting. Yeah. So outside of Java, and then it seems that already it's original. But here's another example from, again, Borneo. So this is another part of Borneo, in this case, the other side. So Kutai is facing Sulawesi, south of Philippines. This one at Batu Pahat, not our Batu Pahat, but Batu Pahat was Kalimantan. Well, Batu Pahat, see, it might be a clue that there might be an inscription there. Because Batu Pahat refers to chiseling of stone. Either it was stone making or there was an inscription. In this case, there is an inscription. There it is. The huge monolith, and for human scale, we have an array of people seated in front, as well as some colonial officials. But you can see, I think you can just about look it up. No, you can't. So actually, these are a series of 7 stupas. Can you see the wings? 7 stupas. And Sanskrit verses, including what it has been written as. Mystery verses from somebody who knows what he's talking about, Peter Skilling, again in Lost Kingdoms. There's one particular, this is from his publication. I'm putting those so that the Sungai Mas Kedah inscription from the and another from the Bujang Valley in don't know specifically where. It's found on the map in the 6th century. No, sorry, it's not found on the map. So we don't know the exact provenance because it was discovered too early for people to bother about provenance at that time. You just find and you cut back. So now we don't know where exactly it was from, unless you can interview the person who found it. Or Captain, I don't know whether this was Captain James Lowe or something else. But I forgot. So 1834, and now in Kolkata Museum. So another thing that Kedah is missing somewhere else. We also are missing it in Kolkata Museum. Singapore Stone, the fragments are also in Kolkata. You know why Kolkata, right? The capital of British India at the time. So everything bring back to your headquarters, PIC. It records this Captain Mahanavika Buddhagutta from Rattamurtaka. So this one is interesting because what's his name? John Gee is saying, yeah, for the longest time it has been thought to be the counterpart for Chitu in Chinese, right? Tanah Merah, probably somewhere in northern, it's Patani, north of Patani, not even the Malaysian side, but the Malay-speaking regions of Thailand, South Thailand. But John Gee is saying it might refer to somewhere in Bengal, maybe, but we don't know. So whichever it is, when we look at these inscriptions then, the script again is similar to the boulders that we've seen earlier. And this again, is telling us, even if Mahanavika Buddhagutta was to be a person from Bengal, the script it was written in is the script used here in Southeast Asia. You get what I'm saying? Yeah. So it's not an Indian script anymore. It is an Indic script that already, apparently, by the 4th century, already had differentiated itself from what you see in India. So 4th century to 6th century is 200 years. That's a long time. So it would be quite foolish for us to still say it is Indian script. And that the script already is part of the circulating literacy in Indic scripts in the region. You get what I'm saying? So then we have to see Kedah as part of this larger context, not just an isolated phenomenon connected directly to India only, and then just these isolated landfalls in terra incognita where natives don't know we live in what form of life. That's not true, right? This is a circulating form of Buddhism within Malay coastal region. So don't forget, Borneo is actually Malay speaking in the coastal regions. But I want to add a word of caution before we end for this section, and that is that it's never that firm, even among experts. So Peter Skilling contra John Gee. What am I talking about? This, if you read the latest summaries for Kedah tour, you read the latest summaries, there are two forms of mantras that are very prevalently found in inscriptions in Kedah. One of them is this particular formula, macam pantun empat baris, tapi bukan. Through ignorance karma, that's the original Sanskrit here. It's actually not empat baris, but this is the translation. And this particular mantra is said by John Gee to belong to the Madhyamika sect, and he refers here to Wheatley, who wrote about this in 1964. And then, strangely enough, after the translation refers to Skilling in a forthcoming work. This is 2014. He is referring to this work by Skilling. But if you read Skilling, Skilling tells us he does not agree with Wheatley. Skilling tells us this verse is not known from any Indian inscription, and it is yet to be traced in any Indian Buddhist text, whether in the original Indic language or in Tibetan or Chinese translation. Tibetan always comes into the picture because Sumatran Tantrism, Malay Tantrism, I must say, Malay Sumatran Tantrism, has its proteges and continuation in Tibetan. Yeah. It's quite strange to think about it, right? Because Malays are no longer Buddhist, so we no longer care about this connection. But the Tibetans know that their form of Buddhism came via Srivijaya, Melayu. So, but what is interesting, so that's why Tibet is suddenly invoked, because you don't find it in translated form in Tibet. So this appears to be unique to the this region, the Straits region. So I want to end there because John Gee is a curator for South and Southeast Asia collection at the MET, Metropolitan Museum. So he will have to rely on other experts to write about it. So he relies here on Wheatley's account from 1964, attributing this to the Madhyamika sect, and then to Skilling in the translation. But Skilling, who reads texts, says, nah, you can't find it in India. But if you look at the Facebook page and the website for Kedah, the claim here is repeated. The Kedah website says this comes from the Madhyamika sect, and then the full name of the sutra is actually mentioned. So I don't know who to believe. Peter Skilling or Wheatley? Wheatley, because Wheatley is the original source. He says it's from that sect. And the Kedah website, the Kedah findings repeat Wheatley's statement that it's from that particular sutra. So I just want to point out that actually this whole, I'm entering into morassy water, murky water with lots of like spikes and barbs. Because even among the experts, there are contestations. So it's really, because how many people are actually, Buddhist textual experts don't look at the Malay world that much yet. But I think it will probably change in the next days. Anyway, let's have a break, I guess. It's probably a good break now. Yeah.
How long do you want?
I don't know, up to you. You're
Maybe it's 10 minutes?
You can suggest. Okay, 10 minutes then. Thank you. I'll see you after the break.
So, a bit of a housekeeping. If you need to use the toilet, just make a sort of like short announcement. Just be very careful as you're sort of like walking through the side of the gallery because these are paintings and artworks. We hope that you don't actually sort of like lean on them as you sort of like walk past. Okay, thank you very much.
Okay. Oh, I guess I will just jump right in. So, thanks for staying, and we're going to move on to the second part. And this is where I don't know whether this is too ambitious, but I want to talk about a kind of, I don't know what to call this, but...
Sorry.
Yeah, sure. I want to start on the second half by firstly, of course, saying that you would have already heard some of the sentiments I expressed earlier about the fact that because of the discontinuity in the culture that is so deeply embedded in religious material culture and religious architecture, right, that existed before the conversion to Islam of Malays, we have a lot of preconceived ideas about how to even approach the pre-Islamic past in material cultural terms, even just that for Malays. And now I'm going to talk about the other side, which is post-conversion. There's also been a lot of, there is an ambivalence and then also a kind of amnesia and then a kind of turning our backs to the various forms of cultural traditions that continue even after the conversion. And I will mostly focus on material culture and only very specifically related to the mosque and gravestone art only. And then I'm going to come back to the Sulalatul Salafin. So actually, let me just talk about this again, right? So for many of us, again, I'm going to point out where Malacca is in relation to all those Buddhist sites that we heard about, right? They're all over here. And then there are, of course, other Buddhist sites as yet not fully explored in Aceh and so on. So again, we don't know yet enough. And then Kedah is there, of course. But when we come to, for years now, there have already been a lot of discussion in Malaysia and rightly so, that the beginnings of the Islamic history of the Malay peoples, for the peninsula at least, because usually when we're talking about Malaysia, we ignore Sumatra. Pasai, for example, we ignore Pasai. We only talk about the peninsula. And so in the peninsula, there have, of course, been justifiable explanations. Look, it's not Malacca, it's Terengganu stone. It's not Terengganu, it's Kedah, look, the grave. You know, that's sort of like we're the first, we're the first, we're the first. But now I'm going to come back to only these traces in Malacca and to a very limited extent Terengganu of the material culture that we can relate back to Islam or early Islam. So in the case of Malacca, I mentioned earlier the mosque. Of course, we have no remains of the mosque, absolutely none. Only thing we do have is this makara and the hewn. Too bad I didn't put the photo here. You all would have known the hewn gravestone of, was it? Okay, correct me if I'm wrong. I'm trying to pluck out of my memory. It was Sultan Muzaffar Shah. So one of the sultans' gravestones hewn into a block, and it was rediscovered in that form because it was hewn like that for use for the Portuguese fortification. I don't know whether you all are aware of this. So it's been rediscovered. It's in Zakaria Ali published it. Zakaria Ali's fantastic survey. So yeah, so you know, there are many other gravestones like that. All these Muslim tombstones from the royal graves and all the blocks of stone were all, you know, basically reused as spolia for the Portuguese fortress. So every time people are so proud of the Portuguese fort, I always feel a sense of irony, but you'll realize. Never mind. Yeah, so anyway, so only the makara and then those huge blocks. But we do know, like I mentioned, that it was made of stone, and there is only one, but this is much later, 1604. The mosque of Malacca could have been built, we don't know, 1420s, 1460s rebuilt, we don't know, you know, we don't know which period, 1460s, but that's definitely much earlier than the mosque of Luwu in Palopo. So this mosque of Luwu in Palopo is interesting in two regards. Number one, its wall. Unfortunately, this picture is a bit washed out, but if you could look at the photograph carefully, the stone is fitted stone in the manner, without mortar, in the manner found on Javanese Candi. Very unique because of this reason in Luwu, Palopo. So I do not know at all whether or not this is the form of construction the mosque of Malacca could have taken, because it apparently was also a squarish mosque with stone cubes. So something like that. But what is interesting, and this is where maybe I will just quickly mention, most of the Malacca mosques, as you know, all the Malacca mosques with this tiered roof form have 4 principal columns, but this is interesting because it has one Sokotunggal. What is interesting about the Sokotunggal, the center column, is that this is used only for Minangkabau mosques and very few Javanese mosques. Very few, and when it's used in Javanese mosques, it's very specific called Sokotunggal. So actually, I'm kind of, is a misnomer because this is not built by Javanese. Apparently, in South Sulawesi, including in Palopo, Luwu, the people who converted the local population were Minangkabau. So it's quite interesting for me from the architectural history point of view that it has the central column. Actually, I shouldn't put Sokotunggal, that's a Javanese term. In Minangkabau, we will call Tonggak Mercu. Tiang Mercu in Malay, but in Minangkabau it becomes Tonggak Mercu, the single central column. But coming back to, okay, this is of relevance in Malacca, because in Malacca, as we know, Minangkabaus inhabit the immediate hinterland of Malacca. We don't know from precisely when, but it seems likely they were already there in the 15th century, attracted by the success of Malacca. Right? And then, of course, the Negeri Sembilan Confederation officially invited Raja Manawa, and the rest is all history. But there is this same configuration, or similar configuration of a stone wall, and then, but in this case, the Mosque of Malacca, we don't know whether it has the Tiang Mercu or whether it has 4 principal columns like Javanese mosques. We have no idea. But in Singapore, we used to have, if you all have been to Sultan Mosque or Masjid Sultan in Singapore, you know now is this Indo-Saracenic fantasy with a gold dome and all that, right? But the original form was like this. So this was the form of the mosque that you would have found in Southeast Asia. I mean, you all know this very well, in Malacca as well. But I just show you this because one of the distinctive features, and I can't remember what, yes. So one of the distinctive features of such mosque is this finial, the mustaka, and then all of these sulukayung, right? The tendril forms, suluran, right? The vine, creeping vine, that adorn the mosque. So actually, what is interesting from the point of view of etymology, so this is an example from Kampung Hulu, is that the name for this, mustaka, or in Javanese, mamolo, apparently refers to the Brahma Mula, the elixir of immortality. And then these, like Pemele, like the Pemele also, is referring to either a Makara or a Naga. One of these creatures, aquatic usually, that would be protecting the Brahma Mula. But of course, this lives on in the mosque, not as a representation of that myth, but as an ornamental form. But for me, the fact that, when you look at these Malacca mosques, don't think that this dates from the Sultanate era, of course not. When the Portuguese arrived, they basically the town was in smithereens. It was all gone. Everything was rebuilt, people had to be attracted back. Even the royal mosque was not spared, what more the community mosques. So what you see here in all these community mosques, Kampung Hulu, Tengkera dengan Kampung Keling, these are all rebuilt either in the course of the 18th century or in the late 17th, in the 1600s. They were rebuilt. And in some cases, like this gateway, it seems to have been built in the 19th century, but they still retain this particular ornamentation form. And also, it's complicated by the fact that in many cases, Chinese contractors were employed in later renovations of the 19th century. So you have all sorts of Chinese ornaments but despite all of that, you can still see this old Momolo or Mustaka and then the Sulur Bayung. So the other thing, of course, is as I mentioned, I don't have a close-up, but if you look at the Tengkera Mosque, it's even more interesting because it's got the Chinese swallowtail motif up here and then the Malay Sulur Bayung at the end, because Chinese constructors were involved. But the point I wanted to make was that as late as the 1930s and 1960s, actually, Malacca Mosque continued to be built by communities. And the Mustaka, in particular, this Pasu, would have been collectively made, the material would have been collectively put together by the community. Usually you use coral. They have to masak the coral, right? And then this reshaped by craftsmen, of course. It's not like I need my cheek and do it, No, but the thing is, there's some craftsmen who do it. But what amazes me is that this tradition continues so strongly in Malacca until the 60s. This is such an ancient ornament. I will show you other examples. So actually what we have in Malacca, all these gems, they continue that particular, the old idea of the Brahmamla honor. Now, the form of the mosque, sorry, I will come back to that later. Now, I'm going to talk about the minarets, because you see 3 different minarets here, right? This one looks like, everybody will say this Chinese pagoda, this one is lighthouse, and then this one is, something. The thing is, right, so this, right, so, but actually what is going on is that these are different echoes of either one of 2 antecedents outside of Southeast Asia. It could be, for example, so here we are kind of veering off topic. It's no longer about the pre-Islamic continuity, but what happens when you don't have that form? And then, it's not that we don't have towers, but if you realize the temple, the main prayer space, or if you can call it even prayer space, the main deity space is this tower, right? Now, it seems that the groups, Malay groups, did not use that form, whether it is a Tier-U form or what, for the minaret. Right? In the first place, of course, minarets were not required in Islamic, for mosques. It was never required. It's a later development. And even in the central Islamic lands, in inverted commas, the antecedents or precedents of the minaret were in pre-Islamic forms anyway. Like Syrian light towers, which are pre-Islamic. When you see Syrian, doesn't mean Islamic, There's pre-Islamic Syrian. So pre-Islamic Syrian towers and so on. So in the case of Southeast Asia, it's quite interesting because the minaret seems to have taken on what we understand as lighthouse-like is actually from the Hadramaut and other littoral regions of Arabia. And then in the case of Singapore, what's very interesting is this is a church spire form, right? Because it was apparently built probably by G.D. Coleman, the colonial architect, but we don't know. But we know that the idea behind such a form, to have it tiered and to have it tapered like that, is not just found within church architecture, but also in the kinds of minarets that you see like this. So there is an idea of a minaret inherited from somewhere that was realized differently by different contractors. So very often when we come to mosque architecture, we get this realization in different forms because the builders were from different building traditions. But it seems that the typological intention was there, just manifested in very different ways. So if you were to compare all of this, I mean, this is in, again, Lebo Aceh Mosque in Penang is of course Hadramaut, right? Yeah, the Aidid family from Aceh. So it takes quite a strong resemblance to what we would see in the, Hadramaut region. Quite strongly resembles, right? Sorry. Strong, what happened here? Suddenly they all don't want to come up. They're gone. But anyway, this is another example from Pagoja in Batavia. Also, here Koja refers to the Khwaja, right? But that term becomes a bit obsolete because the Koja quarter in Batavia became mostly Arab, and this is a Hadramaut Arab mosque with this particular form of the minaret. I'm just putting the what happened here? It all disappeared. I'm putting the Melaka examples in context. The other one would be the Kampung Keling Mosque. This one. You're probably very familiar with this minaret because it's right in the heart of Malacca town. Kampung Keling's minaret. Now, of course, Keling refers to the Tamil Muslims, and in fact, this is the form of Tamil Muslim minarets. It's just that it's forgotten. Most people look at it, oh, pagoda lah, Cina. And so it's like a satu Malaysia harmony kan. Cina punya form pun boleh buat menara. It's not true. It's actually Chulia minaret. So you can find it in either rectangular form. Actually, this rectangular form is the there are seven of such towers in the Nagor Dargah in Nagor, Tamil Nadu. But in the Singapore case, and then here, this is Padang in West Sumatra. There's also a Tamil Muslim community there. And then in some of you might be familiar with the Kapitan Keling Mosque in Penang, right? So Kapitan Keling Mosque in Penang actually has a thicker version of this particular form of the minaret as a relic from its previous form. So much for all of these minarets. But what you notice is in this particular minaret, unlike the one in Singapore, see, there's a difference. This is Singapore Chulia minaret. This is Malacca Chulia minaret. What do you see is the main difference? The Mustaka and the Sulur Bayum. I find that astonishing. To me, that is the strength of that tradition within Malay material culture, if you like. The ornamental motifs used for Malay architecture. This particular, I mean, it's understood here very differently from the Chulia minaret. If you go to the Chulia minarets in Nagor, or in these examples you see here, there is no pavilion on top. Here in Malacca, there is always a pavilion. Big difference. Secondly, it's treated as a pavilion in the roof form. It actually has a roof. It is a roofed pavilion. So in that sense, this is the most unique thing you can imagine. It's a Chulia minaret with a Malacca version of that old Tajuk Tower. So in that sense, there's something that continues there in all of the Malacca tradition. Now, it's also found in Java. So in Java, it can be tiered like that. It can be made of different materials. You can make it of aluminium. Nowadays, it can be made of aluminium, but in the past, it would be made of tin. Yeah, made of tin. But Malacca examples would always have a very elaborated tiered form, sometimes as many as 7 tiers, But there are, you can go around collecting, you can go around looking at all these examples from Malacca. Can you imagine? These were made at various points in Malacca's history by communities. So it just, what does it tell us? The strength of the continuity of tradition within communities. Because to me, it's astonishing. Malacca has lost its kingdom status for the longest time. It was under Portuguese colonial rule, and then it was under. So you want to talk about the Malay community, right? The so-called the base community, the host cultural community. Can you say there's such a thing as the Malacca Malay architectural culture that lived on? Of course, the house. So I'm looking at another one. Yeah? How it continues to persist despite not having any royal patronage. How did it even continue? So from somebody looking at architectural tradition, this is absolutely fascinating. Yeah, how it continued, but also how it melded into the fact that Chinese builders were employed. Chinese builders were employed in many of the renovations, and yet this was replicated. I don't know how it went. Maybe they were told the contractor, okay, kita nak ini benda ke atas, habis dia punya ujung kita mau tambah ini benda. Apa benda ni semua? Like tak apa, letak je. Right? Can you imagine? I'm trying to imagine the negotiation. Yeah. And of course, you have to know that these are, although they refer to Indic ideas, you can't find roof forms with roof ornaments like this in India. You cannot find the Brahma Mula like that and you cannot find the solar biome in this manner, which is a kind of approximation, or rather a foliation of the representation of that creature that protects the Brahmamula. So it becomes like a vine motif instead. Then I mentioned I will just touch a little bit on Terengganu. So if you look at it from the historical perspective, everybody talks about Malacca, nobody talks about Kedah, and then again, you know, Terengganu is like also kind of like, okay, we got the Terengganu stone, but we don't know anything much besides. Now, at the point of time of the Terengganu stone, whichever date you want to believe, Ahmad Adam has now come up with a revised date. 1308, he says, not 1303. Whether it's 1303 or 1308, it is early 14th century, and at that point in time, Majapahit was on the offensive everywhere. Before that was Singasari, right? Successor to Singasari was Majapahit. So Majapahit was on the offensive. Actually, you know, it's very funny to think about it. Malacca Sultanate, in relation to Majapahit, Majapahit pre-exists Malacca and post-dates it. Majapahit was founded 1297. Malacca was only founded circa 1400, right? Malacca was conquered by the Portuguese 1511. Majapahit lived on in various forms until 1527. So actually, you know, that's how long a span of time Majapahit is. So, but Majapahit here, the point is that Majapahit's art forms, or rather, you put it another way, the late versions of the Javanese Indic form that you saw earlier, can be found across, even though we know of no Chandi, and we might be proven wrong one day, who knows? We don't know of Chandi tradition in Terengganu, right? But you might know that all these motifs that existed in Hindu-Buddhist art that can be found in Terengganu. For Islamic forms, whether it is the gateway for a minbar in this case, right? It's actually an abstraction, a highly foliated and beautifully done one too, of the Kalamakara motif. Here done in such a way, you can no longer see the Kalamakara. It's just an ornamental motif for the top of a gateway now. Right? And this is well known in Terengganu culture. I'm just wondering how it arrived within the Terengganu cultural sphere. Right? And then, of course, the way it is foliated is quite unique to what some people have labeled the Lankasuka motif, to kind of like talk about the greater Patani region, that you can't see Terengganu in isolation. And if there is any kind of connection to be made, it might quite likely be back to the Buddhist center that precedes Patani. So probably most of the answers will have to be sought through that connection rather than just to Majapahit, so cannot be so Java-centric. But this is, there you go. So these kinds of tiered forms that you also see later in Batu Aceh can also be found in the Terengganu form. But also this particular, you can also find the use of the Kalamakara stylization for in this case is the this is the minbar for Palopo. This is also minbar actually. Yeah, it's a minbar, not the minbar. This is the minbar also for the mosque in Buton, which is here. And so I will just going to compare how the same motif is translated in various ways across into the Islamic period. There's even a wing motif here. These wing motifs are they adorn a lot of Javanese Chandi temple, Chandi entrances, gateways. The gateways always have wings. So some of the mosques in Cirebon also have wings. This is from the Grand Mosque of Cirebon, quite a well-known Islamic sultanate. So again, this is a kala with a surya, or some people argue this is one-eyed kala. It could be both, because there's a surya motif representing Majapahit right here. So the surya motif is the kind of Majapahit emblem, if you like. And Demak and Cirebon both display the surya motif above their mihrab. So there was a certain continuity within the tradition in Java from the Buddhist. Actually, Majapahit was Buddhist more than it was Hindu. Again, people forget that. I think for some reason we keep identifying as Hindu. Now, the relationship between the two is much more complex than what I can summarize here. But just understand, for example, in Thailand, the king is Buddhist, but he does maintain the Brahmanical rites for his consecration. That giant swing, for example, is a Hindu rite. It coexists in Southeast Asian kingdoms. It always coexists. But in case of Java, it's much more complicated than that. The two religions were actually accorded equal status in the Majapahit capital. It seems from the way the temples are laid out. But anyway, the more kind of like the religion that Majapahit usually talks about, and that usually it takes pride of place for royal sanctuaries in the Majapahit period was Buddhism. Just to clarify. So anyway, this is the, I think you can make out before that thing. Yeah, this is the mihrab niche with lotus capitals, and then this is a kala makara niche of two lobes, and then the makara is coming out at the sides. So it's its own version. It has this endless knot motif, which seems to refer to Central Asian, and then via that back to Chinese forms of art, the endless knot motif. So it's a lot of Chinese motifs entered and became very popular in the Central Asian Islamic realms. So a lot of it also came via that, the Samarkand, Bukhara, it came via that, because a lot of Southeast Asian Muslim scholars in the early period apparently were under Kurdish ulamas. So there is this very roundabout connection from China via that, come down back, and then you have all these motifs from the Chinese influenced art of Central Asian Islamic kingdoms. That's the back of the, again, a kala face here, and then motifs of medallions. There's a bit too much to explain, but I wanted to show you that this is something that in Southeast Asia we don't see enough examples of, and so it becomes very astonishing when we encounter it, because the examples are so few and so isolated. A lot of it is concentrated on Java. Outside of Java, besides the mustaka or momolo, the mustaka and the sulur bayung that I showed you in Malacca, and then the form of the kala makara for frames, we can't really find it in Islamic art. So it's not so not something that was able to, and there are many reasons people are kind of attributing to this phenomenon. Not many examples of very well developed art that takes after the pre-Islamic into the Islamic and developed on its own. So not that many. And the few that you do have would be in the form of the mosque. Because now this again, we would have to caution ourselves against calling this Hindu or Buddhist. It's a hall form. But it is used to express the notion of the stupa, which then became understood as the dagoba or pagoda. And it's not specifically Chinese, although Chinese also built pagodas, but this notion of the meru, right, was found, for example, in Burmese architecture as well. Right? The multi-tiered roofs, you might be familiar with that. And also it lives on today in Bali, although it was also found in Java, right? The meru form. So the meru form, you can continue to elaborate on this to as many tiers as you want. It can be up to 11. And there's a difference. You can distinguish the structural format and the way the top tiers are supported between meru and tajuk mosque and wantilan. So they're all actually different. So when you get a sheet is not to the same scale. And if you're to the same scale, this is a lot smaller. Okay, this whole thing can just fit here. This particular example here. So these are the huge hall forms that were built for mosques in the region, and they are continuations of earlier forms of the pavilion, the sacred pavilions, or otherwise, just ordinary pavilions or the sacred pavilions that were used in this manner for, in this case, Hindu deities. This is Shiva and Vishnu, Shiva 11, Vishnu 9 tiers. This is a late example. This temple was built 1720. So you can imagine when people were building mosques in the 1500s, 1600s, here you have in Lombok this late example of the 9 and 11. Of course, for the deity towers, there's a big difference. The deity towers is just seen in the Balinese Hindu tradition, as well as in the Javanese one, as what they call, they don't need the deity's statue. And so it's just an empty chamber to invite the manifestation of the deity into the chamber. So that's how they see, and this is kind of like, if you read Gauden's Dominique talking about how in the architecture of the region there is this notion of certain antennas, certain antennas are built into buildings, metaphorically. So this is seen as a kind of, almost like an antenna, a kind of receptacle. Maybe antenna makes it sound funny because you associate it with television, but kind of receptacle, to draw it in. So there's that symbolism. It seems that that's the kind of symbolism that continued to have some relevance when people were building mosques. So some of the early mosques really give you that impression of the continuity of that form, the Meru Tower. There's one particular one which is 65, sorry, this is for Singapore, HDB. 26 stories, okay? Can you imagine? It is the equivalent of a 26-story public housing block. It's still there, Limau in Minangkabau. Now the thing about the Minangkabau examples is that it has that central tower. So there's one tower in the center, the Tonggak Machu. Right, in the center. Whereas, so it's more like this one, right? You see there's one tower in the center. Some of them, some can be very elaborately carved. Others will have one central tower, you can't really see, it's behind the lady, but there's one tower, a central column, and then 4 others. It could be like that as well. So there's this form here. And you could have false upper stories like that. False upper stories, so you get that, for example, here, Banten. So a Sultanate building in the 1500s. Yeah, and the Sultans of Banten called themselves Maulana. And the mosque is like that. So it's a very interesting continuity of that pre-Islamic notion of the tiered roof building as sacred. Of course, now it's completely applied to something different. And what you notice also is that they also have this. Can you see? It's just a little bit watered down over here. And then here is a bit bigger. The Mustoko, what the Javis call Mustoko. But in the case of both examples, there is no Sulul Bayum. So it appears that Sulul Bayum survives more strongly, very interesting, in Malacca than it did in many of the examples of mosques I observed in Java. Other ways of continuity in Java there would be, which we don't find in the Malay Kingdom. Demak claims that this front pavilion, the Serambi of the mosque, uses Majapahit columns. They are spolia from some kind of audience hall from some part of the Majapahit ruler's palace, supposedly. That has big symbolic importance because the Serambi for Javanese mosque is where the Qadi would hold court. So cases are adjudicated here. So meaning if you say that the hall of Majapahit is now reused for the Qadi, the chief Qadi of the Demak kingdom that carries some kind of a symbolic import. But also the continuity of forms of Javanese pre-Islamic traditions of reckoning time or of writing. So here, above this, what you will always find, right? There will always be Arabic verses. Above that is actually something written in Javanese Hanacaraka, which Malays do not continue. We did actually, for a point in time, Malays continued the Kawi script, but then it was lost. We completely switched to Jawi. Among the Javanese, Hanacaraka continued quite strongly, and Jawi was called Pagon. So Pagon was understood as something a bit peculiar. In fact, the etymology of it means something slanted or something like off, So they saw it as rather foreign. So that's quite different from how the Malays saw Jawi. Jawi is, identity for Malays. So there are some interesting comparisons with Java. The fact also here that there is a chronogram. The Javanese had a tradition of chronograms. So you can read the year from this. Yeah. And then you might have heard of the fact that there is a penyu inside of, I didn't include the picture. Inside of the Demak Mosque, there is another chronogram in the form of penyu, a tortoise, or is that a turtle? Turtle. And so the turtle can be read to give you 1408 Shaka. Shaka, that's the thing. The dates for mosques and for many of the early gravestones in Java were in Shaka era. So it's that kind of an overlap that I think we don't understand. And I mentioned that the minaret, right, took after the form of either Julia or Hadramaut, but there was one experiment, it seems, in Kudus to have a minaret take after the Chandi architecture, and guess what? It has a pavilion at the top. Doesn't that remind you of the Malacca example? Remember the fact that the minaret has a pavilion at the top, and the pavilion is roofed. This kind of tower reminds us of drum towers. That we use in some temples. They continue to be used in Bali today as kulkul. They're called kulkul, that's the name of it. For mosques, we still have the beduk or the, what was the other term for it? Tabu. Yeah. So in Sumatra, it's usually called tabu, but in Malay circles, it could be called both, beduk or tabu. But the other thing that's interesting is some of these mosques actually have a very elaborate layout of courtyards, gateways, and pavilions. So there are many such examples in Java. I'm only showing you one, Kudus. So again, this does not seem to have continued in Sumatra or in the Malay Peninsula. I'm just giving a comparative example. So what we see in Java and it's very different from what we see in Sumatra and the Malay Peninsula, but we do have Aceh. Or maybe we had Malacca, but we don't know because everything has been dismantled. Who knows? We have no idea. But in the case of Aceh, again, everything was destroyed by the Dutch, but very late in 1878, when there was a conquest of Aceh. And so everything was burned down, including the royal mosque. So the only things that survive are these three brick monuments within the old palace complex. And they refer, now again, Aceh prided itself in connections to Ottoman Muslim world, was the patron of Islamic scholarship, hosted Muslim scholars, right? But at the same time, it continued some of the older forms of kind of symbolic architecture that alluded to pre-Islamic motifs. Yeah? So for example, in the understanding of, say, isolation to meditate, yeah? The king would have used this thing called a gunungan, which alluded to the notion of the holy mountain, which is inherited, of course, from the older, now arguably Indic and also pre-Indic, right? Yeah, this notion of the mountain. So this gunungan here, actually there's an elaborate way to go up, and then there are all these ornaments that derive from the Hindu-Buddhist architectural styles of temples. You can just about make out this lotus capital-like form at the top. This used to have a pavilion on top. There's a very elaborate description of this structure in its full glory with, can you believe it? They use different kinds of metal for the pavilion. Of course, all that kind of kapol. When the Dutch came, I think they must have dismantled everything. So there is an account in the Tajus Salatin. The Tajus Salatin tells us about this and the whole taman, the whole complex. So anyway, I mean, you can also see this this form of the gateway, a kind of simplified version of the Meru towers that you would find on temples, and of course here this map is just to show you Aceh's dominion during the height of its power after Malacca fell to the Portuguese. So in a way, in many cases, you will hear people talk about not just Johor as a successor state. In fact, in some cases, you might argue Johor is less successful as a successor state to Malacca. So the more successful between Johor and Aceh was Aceh usually, because many of the Muslim traders who wanted to avoid passing through Portuguese Malacca would go by this way. So when you go by this way, Aceh, of course, was the one in control of the tip and then all of the side. So it became the more powerful between the two. So in that sense, the Melayu kind of inheritance fell to Aceh, and Johor was able to get by, but not as in the manner in which Aceh was able to. And so to me, this is quite something to think about. What happened in the case of the discontinuity? It's such a big continuity because all the major centers for Buddhism that we know of so far are all down here, if you remember. Aceh might have had some, but it seems nothing has come up. And so Aceh, then for Aceh to continue that tradition suddenly, again is the question, how did it come about? Were the builders formerly builders from the Buddhist centers? And then they were recruited to build in. Why did Aceh build that gunungan? All these questions come up, right? Where did the idea come from? That Pintu Kop. Why? Why didn't they just get Ottoman builders or like now Putrajaya, right? All looking like Persianate and Ottoman and whatnot. Wilayah Sultan Masjid looks like it could be plonked here from Istanbul or something. I don't know. How come Aceh didn't do that? You know what I mean? So that's really quite interesting for me. And then this thing about the I mentioned earlier the transition of literacy into the new script that today Malays take as like the core of identity, right? Jawi. So core of Islamic Malay identity, I suppose you would say. In the case of the Terengganu inscription, I think it's already well known. The kinds of terminology used there are quite curious. So, for example, God is referred to as Dewata Mulia Raya. Yeah. God is referred to as Dewata Mulia Raya. Can you imagine? In Jawi, I mean, in this script, which we today call Jawi, I don't know what they called it yet back then. Dewata Mulia Raya. Written in Jawi, I mean, imagine the effort to spell Dewata Mulia Raya. Just use Allah is easy, what? It's already in Arabic, but instead it used Dewata Mulia Raya. So it was a conscious effort to bridge that transition. Because people were still referring to God as Dewata Mulia Raya. So at least we know, oh, Malays use Dewata Mulia Raya. How poetic. Yeah, it's quite interesting, right? And then, of course, now it's completely obsolete. Who would use Dewata Mulia Raya today? You can't imagine Khutbah Jumaat, Dewata Mulia Raya. Dewata Mulia Raya. Can you imagine? But this is Islamic law. This whole edict is about Islamic law. And it uses Dewata Mulia Raya. I just want this to kind of like really be. And then you have these examples. These are fantastic. So I mentioned earlier Aceh, and then, I didn't mention Pasai, and all the other smaller kingdoms nearby. Pedir, you know, there are many other kingdoms. Lok Sumawe, which is a Pedir. So this particular gravestone, which is also quite well known, is at Pasai, and it's called Minya Tujuh. But look at it. I mean, it's actually written in Arabic as well as Kawi on the other gravestone. So one gravestone is in Arabic, the other gravestone is written in Sumatran Kawi in Old Malay. And look at the date. It's later than Terengganu stone. So Terengganu started using Arabic already, lettering, not language. Language was Malay. The Terengganu stone used Malay language, but used Jawi. So in Terengganu they were using that. But here, nearer to the Islamic West, this gravestone, just imagine the paradox. Terengganu is facing China already, you know, right? It's further away from the Indian Ocean where Muslim traders were dominant, right? And then here you have in Pasai, which was as Islamic as it gets, Hikayat Raja Pasai, right? He's talking about the first Islamic kingdom in the region. And this gravestone uses Kawi as well as Jawi. So there was a clear overlap in literacy which we have completely forgotten about. Completely. But here in Pasai, there it is, the gravestone with Kawi, as well as Arabic. I mean, the etymology, okay, they sound like they rhyme, right? Like somebody planned all along, Jawi, Kawi, but actually they have completely different etymologies. Kawi comes from Kavya, which is Sanskrit for poet. So Kawi, the writing of the poet. Kawi refers to poet, from poet. Jawi refers to people from the Bilad al-Jawa, which was what Central Muslim lands referred to us as. So the Bilad al-Jawa are the countries of Jawa. Now that harks back to, remember the Zabaj and Javaka? So the whole region was just called Java basically. And then you know some European maps called Sumatra, Java Major, Java Minor, and then Java is Java Major. So the whole region was called Java, and so people from Java are Jawi, and so their writing is Jawi. So it looks like it's planned like Kawi Jawi. Very neat. So another one, this one is a bit more interesting because now we come to the Malay Peninsula. Pengkalan Kempas, 1467, and there are two dates for the two different sites, you know. There's an inscription in Arabic that gives 1460. No, I can't remember which one is which. I think 1463 is the one in Arabic, 1467 is the one in Kawi. I think so, I can't remember right now. But it's in both. Anyway, I'm showing you the one in Kawi. So I always make the joke, you know, yeah, you look at, oh, I can read Bismillahirrahmanirrahim, and then am I supposed to turn this upside down? You know, because that looks like a wow, and then no, it's not. You know, so this is so interesting because it is that again that transition period that we have completely forgotten. And in the case of Java, there is a very clear transition period. These are all Muslim gravestones in Trowulan. They show the Majapahit sunburst motif. This one uses the tight scroll, tight lontar strips book. So this is written in Javanese numerals, giving you the Shaka date. That one is in Arabic script. So it's really in nothing astonishing in the case of Majapahit, for example. And you have these dates. Please look at these dates. These are contemporaneous with the Sultanate of Malacca. Zaman Kesultanan Malacca. And then this one, Minya Amal Majnun, also Zaman Melaka what? Zaman Melaka. People were still using kawi. I think nobody noticed it when I was showing this. Must be long ago. This is Zaman Melaka. People were using kawi. It's just forgotten, that's all. Right? It's just completely forgotten. And in the case of Java, they never forgot because they continued using it. It could have been because of the strength of Aceh, partly. Because Aceh, I think, never quite used kawi. Aceh used Arabic script. And the gravestones that Aceh produced, Batu Aceh and the earlier traditions just before that, these are all from Aceh. So, you know, all the gravestones of the Malay rulers of Malacca are Batu Aceh, as far as we know. And so on. All the other kingdoms that were offshoots of Malacca also use Batu Aceh. Perak uses Batu Aceh, Johor uses Batu Aceh. So Batu Aceh never uses kawi. That's one of the characteristics of Batu Aceh. So exported from Aceh would be these Arabic inscribed tombstones. So but these are Pasai. So Pasai is one of the centers for the production of Batu Aceh actually. And here are some examples. So Elizabeth Lamburn, as well as more recently Daniel Perret. Daniel Perret is, I think, sometimes based here in Kuala Lumpur, FAO. So they have both written very, very dense papers. Of course, not forgetting the pioneer and all this, Othman Muhammad Yatim. Othman Muhammad Yatim also wrote about Batu Aceh, the book. So these are all scholars who have studied this particular tradition. But what I want to emphasize is, even though there's another paradox, I love introducing these paradoxes. So you look at all of these tombstones. This is like a boundary marker in the pre-Islamic period. This one is part of a... People don't know the original context. If you go to the Ahmad Majanu, it's a pillar seemingly in cement, and then these 4 plugs embedded into the cement. You don't know whether this was originally like that or not. You know, was it all along like this? So on 4 sides like that. It's a pillar. It's not even a gravestone with headstone, footstone. Ahmad Majanu one. It's quite strange. But and then this one would be more like the Kala Makara, and sometimes the I forget, but a form of the Kala Makara would be Kijang here. Not this one though. This one is Kala Makara, but there's another form with the leaping Kijang, which doesn't seem to. This is supposed to be a stylization of that leaping Kijang. There's some examples where you can actually see the Kijang. But when you come to Batu Aceh, suddenly the Chandi motif reappears. I've written about this curious phenomenon. It seems that, just like in the case of Kudus, just now I showed you, remember Kudus with the red brick tower and all the gateways? Kudus is a late kingdom and founded by an imam who rejected what happened in Demak and decided to set up his own center. He was he the third imam, or I'm so sorry, I cannot remember. He was either the third imam or something like that, but not the first imam, just like Aloy, third kapitan. So he was the third imam or something, or fourth, and he had a falling out with Demak's rulers, and so he left and set up his own new theocratic center, Kudus, and calling it Kudus no less. Kudus, of course, refers to Jerusalem, you know. So he's saying, I am Jerusalem. If you Demak think you're Makkah, I am Jerusalem. And guess what he chose to build for his new Jerusalem? Menara Kudus itu, that is not taken over from a pre-Islamic temple. No, it was purpose-built from the beginning as a mosque tower. We know this for a fact because it's oriented towards the Qibla for one thing. And all of the niches for statues are blind niches. I mean, they're just there for stylistic purposes. You know, like how sometimes in neoclassical architecture we just make blind facades. Yeah, so this was done for that tower. But that is an example from Java. So you have imam who sets up a new Jerusalem and then decides to build in this particular manner, which recalls very strongly the architecture of Majapahit. Now, in this case, Aceh is so far removed from all the Buddhist centers that we know of. Initially built tombstones like that, and then later on built tombstones in the manner of the Chandi. I actually already saw this before Daniel Perret wrote his brilliant paper, but now I would have to say Daniel Perret saw it. Because it's so obvious. Don't you think it's obvious? Look at this. These are antifixes. Remember, I don't know whether you recall enough the image earlier. These antifixes at the base, this particular plinth, the moldings, the reticulated harmika, or you can call it stupica, depends. But all of it, so much of it points back to Chandi architecture, the articulation. It's just astonishing. So in fact, this, like the case of Kudus, is not an early example where, oh, because first very, very Hindu-Buddhist and then become less and less and then become very Islamic and then completely Islamic now look like Putrajaya. It's not like that. It's not like that. It's like this. First it was Hindu-Buddhist and then there was a period when it was quite plain. The earliest Islamic monuments were quite plain. And then they elaborated it using the pre-Islamic forms. It's like a revival. And then it is elaborated in ways not seen like that in the pre-Islamic period. That's very important to emphasize. It's not exactly, you can't see something exactly like this in the Javanese Candi. And many of the gateways you see in Kudus or in Sendang Duur, all those fantastic Javanese Islamic tomb complexes, right? All those gateways. We cannot call them Hindu Javanese because these gateways were not exactly like that in the period when the Javanese were Buddhist. Actually, Buddhist is always Hindu Javanese, but actually mostly Buddhist. When the Javanese were Buddhist, those gateways were not exactly like that. So the gateways that were produced in the Islamic period were quite different, but they are continuations of that tradition, right? So unfortunately, because we are not like Orang Putih, we don't have a clear periodization of our history of art and architecture. We see everything as the same. Whereas in Europe, you pantang, you want to say Baroque is the same as Rococo. Even Baroque and Rococo look so similar, you cannot say they are the same. But for us, everything the same. This is the kind of problem with our imprecise art historiography. Semua sama, and Orientalist scholarship, yeah, the unchanging East Orientals, they never change. They cannot change because, that kind of perception, but actually it changed. So I want to emphasize, although I said that, I'm not saying this is exactly what you would find, no. It is derived from that, but it is so different. But you cannot deny that it takes from the articulation of the Chandi, and so many elements of it. In some cases, it's not so much attributable to Chandi, it's also attributable to local. So although I'm talking about Aceh, I'm really talking about the Malay Peninsula because the Malay Peninsula has so many hundreds and still being discovered. I know for a fact that in the past few years in Kedah, there have been so many Batu Aceh being rediscovered, right? Sultan yang ke-19, Sultan yang ke-11, Sultan yang ke-12, they keep discovering, it's been there all along, only the villagers know. And now it has come into the purview of the Jabatan. Fantastic, I think. So it's only now, you can imagine, only 2016, 2015, people are rediscovering these things. Thank God it's still around, the Batu Aceh, But yeah, so hundreds of Batu Aceh on the peninsula because of the power of this, the power of this artifact, it became so successful as a commodity. Actually, it was a commodity. Aceh, Pasai was exporting this. Can you imagine? It was an industry. And the very rich and powerful rulers, no less, would buy this. So the place to buy tombstone would be Aceh, or rather Greater Aceh, Pasai. That's quite fantastic. I was going to say these motifs are actually local Achenese. Yeah, these shoulder-like things, they look like wings. That's the thing. That's what the Achenese, Achenese as well as Uthman Muhammad Yatim, the scholars would tell us. But I also see in this the wing motifs that you find in Islamic gateways, Islamic period gateways, like in Cirebon. So something about the motif of wings, wing motif seems to be quite important. I'm gonna kind of go through a few more the anthropomorphic. As you know, in Islamic art history, it's not true to say that there is no anthropomorphism in art. Anybody who looks at Persian or even Arabian forms of receptacles, you would know that there exist representations. There are the famous lions of Alhambra and so on. Now, in the Malay Islamic world, right, there were these, or Java for that matter, there were all of these Nagas and Makaras and so on. So I took this example because I was giving a talk for ACM docents. So I was telling them, don't always trust the catalog. Sometimes the catalog can be wrong. It says this is a Naga, Kepala Naga. It's wrong. It's not a Naga because you can see the belalai. So it's a Makara. It's a Makara. It looks very similar, but it's got the belalai. The belalai is the giveaway. It's not a Naga already. So anyway, this is a duck-billed Naga, but it's a Naga. There's no belalai. It's like duck. Javanese Nagas always have a mouth that looks like duck-bill. It's quite cute, like their Naga. It looks quite harmless. Like it will just go quack. I don't know. But Javanese Nagas, I don't know whether you've seen gong stands that will have the twirling Naga up there. The Naga always has a duck bill and the mahkota like that. And then this one, of course, there's no question about it. It's a makara because of the belalai. It's quite tall. And well, I'm just showing you examples. So it lives on, and look at that in Kota Baru, the royal circumcision procession on this fantastic, gigantic. Of course, you all know this is Moving Shepherd punya collection lah. He has all these fantastic photographs, right, of something we've completely forgotten about. Burung Petala Indra that they built with this pavilion on top, all these other examples. But yeah, and then sometimes it looks less obvious, but this is also a representation of bird. So really beautiful crafted objects, which we will associate nowadays with Islamic Malay culture. But some of the traces of that representation. This one is Brunei manufactures. This one. Oh, Brunei is also fantastic. Another gigantic 1933 Burung Petala Indra. But these are examples where I wrote about the notion of the king as Indra, keindraan. Now Indra has a mouth, right? Yeah. So you get the picture. This is a survival of that. And then that metaphor, right? We still call it keindraan, right? Indra, the ruler. Indra is of course from Hindu mythology, and here it is quite literally translated, right? For royal processions. Another one. This is Patani. All these huge birds that are held aloft. But anyway, date unknown. Probably 1920s or 30s. Now I come to this, the most Islamic looking of manuscripts, the Sulalatul Salatin. This is written in Jawi. Of course, there are many references to the pre-Islamic period. And I chose this in particular because it comes from the British Library. It's actually copied in Singapore at Tanah Merah, of all places. Those of you who come to Singapore, you take the MRT, you have to change station at Tanah Merah, right? This guy was somewhere in the vicinity in the early 19th century, writing this out, copying from a Malacca manuscript, apparently. Now, what's interesting about the Sulalatul Salatin I mentioned earlier is the cultural memory. The Moratatang passage I was talking about, the fact that it refers back to Palembang when nobody at that time knew the significance of Palembang. Remember, this Sulalatul Salatin is written in Johor, right, in the 17th century. Of course, people have made the remark that most likely it was a collection of older texts compiled and also written partly, newly written, partly a compilation of older sources, but that it refers to Palembang, it refers to, it seems to mix up a number of things. It refers to Raja Shulan. We're not sure whether that refers specifically to the Chola or not, but it mixes up a lot of things, because if you're talking about Palembang, that is about 300 to 400 years older than the Chola attack. 300 years, more or less. Well, it depends on how long you think Sriwijaya is. The Malay inscriptions are dated to 6, 7 something AD and so on, right? But the Chola attack is the 11th century, so it's so much later. But the cultural memory embedded there seems to mix the two up, because this is anachronistic, that Cucu Raja Shulan is the Menglebar down. Unless you're saying that somebody who was in power at Palembang at that time was a descendant of one of the Chola. But you don't know. So that's one of the interesting kind of like conflation of time periods. And then it refers to that Moratatang site where the oldest dated Malay inscription from the 7th century comes from. So long predating the Chola attacks. Yeah. And then referring to Melayu, which is actually not in Palembang but neighboring Jambi. But Moratatang goes in that direction. I think I have the, did I have the, there it is. So there is another, but this is the Batanghari 9, so that's Palembang. And going to Jambi here, is this particular, it's not shown on this map even. There's another connection which you can take as a kind of highway to Jambi from Palembang without going to the sea. And this is the Batanghari Leko, they call it. Batanghari Leko does this, it goes up like a highway. So Moratatang is connected to that particular connection. I'm just showing you the inscriptions that were discovered at Bukit Seguntang, at Moratatang, and so on. So I just want to kind of come back to this point that for some reason, although it was already in the 17th century, and there was no real reason for somebody living in Johor to recall all the way back that far, that memory was encoded in the Sulalatul Salatin. Coming back to Palembang, talking about Raja Shulan. What is a puzzle for me though, and this is coming to Kedah, is that the Sularatu Salatin is completely silent on Kedah. No mention. It mentions Palembang, it mentions Melayu, it does not mention Kedah. And this seems to be probably a corroboration of the fact that after the Chola attack on Kedah, the Cholas installed their region there as a kind of colony, if you like, as a trade colony. Yeah? And so perhaps, this is one reason why the Melayu of Palembang and Jambi, and then later on Singapura and then Malacca, right, chose to not talk about Kedah at all. Does not even mention. But there's a mention of Raja Shulan though. So for me, this is inconclusive. But there are so many questions raised. Because if you remember I Ching talking about the fact that he was coming... Okay, first the context of I Ching. We have to remember I Ching was going from Guangzhou to go to Pataliputra, which is the port to get to Nalanda, to copy scriptures. So on the way, he touched base at Sriwijaya. The Srivijayan ruler supported him as he does all Buddhist pilgrims, and then he stayed there for, I cannot remember, a great number of years. But the reference to 12, somebody disputed, saying that's a standard way to say that everybody who is studying something will be spending 12 years somewhere. It's just a standard. But then there was another expression saying he then stayed further 2 years in Melayu. So 12 years in Sriwijaya, 2 years in Melayu. So probably 12, we can take it at face value. 12 in Sriwijaya, and then he was sent to Melayu on the Srivijayan ruler's ship. And then from Melayu, he was sent to Kedah. And then from Kedah, sent to Pataliputra, the port to get to Nalanda. So it means that already in the 7th century, when I Ching was traveling, there were these 3 main centers already. It specifically connects just 3. Just 3. And then the Arab sources also in the 8th, 9th, 10th century, 11th century, also always talking about Kedah in relation to what they call Sriwijaya, right? Different names for it. So that's rather interesting that the Sejarah Melayu makes no mention. Absolutely no mention. I suspect it's because of the Chola invasion. Now we come to Kedah. So it becomes, therefore, presentist anxiety in the context of Malaysia. This is the scariest part of today's because when you come too close to the present, raw nerves are touched. I mean, there are many, many things about Kedah that will also be... you have to understand Kedah in its totality as a site and in its long span of existence, as well as its long span of being studied and restudied. Right? So, for me, it's one of the big new chapters for Malaysian historiography, I think. And we have, of course, a lot of experts already doing, very, very work that will not make people sit up. It's all the groundwork that you have to do before you can say anything. It's extremely difficult to try and understand something like this. So right now, I'm glad, for the past, I don't know how many years, right? It's already come out in the papers. For example, in 2013, there was a 2010 conference on Bujang Valley held in Kuala Lumpur. So for the past decade, there has been renewed archaeological interest in Kedah. Of course, we have to look at this in the context of, let me go back, this longer history of people studying it, right? And earlier I had another slide showing when Quaritch Whale studied it, and Alistair Lamb studied it, and so on. And so now you have the latest kind of revisiting of this site to study it. But what I find a little bit uncomfortable about this is, again, it's always talked, it's a nationalistic thing. So it's like trying to say that it appears to be the oldest civilization in Southeast Asia. I don't know if you want to bother saying that, because it could be oldest, it could be as old as others, it doesn't matter. It's just old, I think. You don't have to say it's the oldest in Southeast Asia. Don't say that lah. Nanti kalau bukan oldest, then how? Now they are using LiDAR in Cambodia and discovering fantastic things there. I hope one day we can use LiDAR for Kedah as well, or Melayu sites. Because, look, it's so difficult, the site. Yeah? And the kind of bricks, if you look at it, how do we even reconstruct? Brick is much more difficult to reconstruct than stone. So the Javanese archaeologists had it easy. The archaeologists in Java had it easy. Stone block, senang. For saw. Whereas this one is brick. So it's like you can bet that you're all going to be very disappointed with what results. It's like all flat. because you cannot build beyond a certain level. But it's going to be just as dramatic as the Melayu Muara Jambi site. That means it's quite extensive. I mean, look at that, it's extensive, you know. You know how it's really an extensive area, but all rather small temples. So in a way, it's rather similar. Both sides of the Straits of Malacca seem to have very similar temple building traditions that are quite small, based largely on brick. Makaras have been found. There have been color heads, and they seem to be part of a larger landscape. So all those things that we discussed earlier. But yeah, that's to me kind of a way to. I wanted to end on this note because despite all of this excitement, I think there is a certain unease about embracing or accepting this history among. I don't know how Malay people in general, being Malay myself, look upon this history. It seems it's taken so long and there's been no embrace. I mean, it's already been known since the 1950s. Probably it didn't help that the element of Chola invasion came into the picture. Even sejarah Melayu tak nak cakap. Right? So then we enter into presentist anxieties about being conquered by somebody else. You know, that sort of thing, having a viceroy installed there by the Cholas. But you see, and so then it becomes complicated. When a particular Chandi got bulldozed, it became a Tamil versus Malay thing. I mean, that's absurd. Candi Bukit Batu Pahat was in all probability built by Malays. You know. But you see, I mean, I salute Datuk V. Nagarajan. It's just that I wish, other people would also be collaborating with him. He would also collaborate with other people, and we don't start seeing this as a Tamil thing. I think the Chola conquest of Kedah makes it very complicated. So unlike Jambi, so I'm going to go to this one, you know. So there are these kind of incendiary people who are opportunistic, of course. I mean, we all understand this is opportunism. I mean, it's quite strange, you know. It's really strange to me. I mean, there's even the Tamil tiger there. It's turning into something else. But you see, bertepuk kena dua tangan. So where are the Malays in this? The Malays are in data enda, right? I mean, of course, I'm not talking about our scholars, right? Scholars are different. I'm talking about just general sentiment. So general sentiment is completely lacking. It is a Tamil general sentiment that is there, and then, of course, as is usual in any community, it is the most boisterous who are visible, you know, whereas everybody else. This you can contrast, and I'm ending on this. You can contrast with what's happening in Melayu. This is Melayu, Jambi. Over there, they completely accept it. It is part of their past. Yes, they are Muslims, but this is part of their past. And you know who we can take precedence from in this case? Egyptians lah. It's not like we're not, but Egyptians have an even longer pre-Islamic past. And you can look back at what Al-Azhar scholars wrote in the 1920s and 1930s when they were debating about how, as good Muslims, you know, look, I am not here to preach. I'm not a religious scholar. I'm only talking about how politically this is being negotiated among people who are adherents of a religion that would, you know, if they followed the religion to the letter, would probably look askance at the pre-Islamic past or not. Or not. The or not but part is very important because Al-Azhar scholars give us an opportunity to understand how Egyptians have dealt with their even bigger and more monumental pre-Islamic past. Thank you. Yeah.
Are there any questions for Iran?
Yeah. I heard there is a saying that currently I'm studying magic. There is in places where there is no triangle mountain, there will be no great magicians there in Malay superstition. Without triangle mountain, there will be no great magicians. Is there any connection with the Mukara or with the structure of the
Maru roof, you mean?
Maru roof and everything?
who knows? Where is this?
With the what do you call
Brahmamula, or the Momolo, yeah, or Mustaka, yeah.
Is it used for cosmic energy, to harness cosmic energy or something like that? Is there some reference to it?
No, as far as I know, no. But I would like to know where is the source for the statement you made about in Malay magic there's an understanding of the triangular mountain as being necessary for magic or something. Where is that from?
Part of Lisan tradition.
Lisan tradition, okay.
Lisan tradition. From what I know that there should be a triangle-shaped mountain.
I see.
If you want to study, if that place has great magician, there has to be like triangle-shaped mountain because the triangle-shaped harness the cosmic energy.
I think for me it's very interesting to hear that. I have no idea where, and how it has translated into the Meru form. From what I know is from the architectural history perspective. So those pavilion forms that you see on the temple reliefs, that was adapted into the need for huge halls for mosques. I'm not sure whether that was read as a triangle, because of course a pyramidal Hebrew form is not necessarily read as a triangle, right? So I don't know. So my answer would be maybe this is interesting from if we are able to pursue in which circles that belief was operating, and so whether the mosque had any relevance to that circle. Yeah.
In Hindu beliefs, not Hindu, we also believe that cosmic energy comes through benda-benda runcing. Through our fingers.
Right.
Like that. Yeah.
And that is what Gordon Dominic was talking about when he meant the antennas. So a lot of the architecture of the region that refers back to very autochthonous beliefs, Batak architecture, Penan rituals, they always make a kind of platform which has these antennas that are supposed to be ways by which, because it's like a point, right? By which this notion of cosmic energy, we are sounding very esoteric, but this is the notion that from the tips of things, right? That's why in Malays, believe that if you cut the hair, you cut the nail, you can use jampi on the nail and hair, right? You've heard of this, right? Because it comes from the tips. Anyway, yeah. You're absolutely right. So it could be an amalgamation of these notions of tips, and they are important.
And in Malay, mantra, jampi, until very late, we also mention Shiva, Batara, Guru, and everything, because Malays are syncretists.
Yeah.
We are mostly enemies first, and then Buddha, Hindu, we are all in one. Not just we are enemies, then we are Buddhists, then we are Hindus, and then we are Muslims, but we are all everything in one at one time. Yeah. Even until later period in the mantras and everything, there's mention of Batara Gurus and with mentions of Allah and everything.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that also translates into the architectures and everything. You said that this is Hindu architecture or Buddhist architecture. It's actually Malay architecture.
Yeah, the syncretic. Yeah. We should see this mantra. Yeah, totally. Thank you.
Question.
I just have a comment. Last week you said about why the Malays have this dichotomy about not embracing at least the Malays in Malaysia. The dichotomy about not embracing the Hindus or Buddhist caste. I think it has a lot to do with the way history is taught to us. Because history, the way it's taught locally, at least in my time, I don't know how it's taught now, it's very discreet. But it's at a glance, it seems like the way people teach European history, like Iran and what goes on. But in actuality, there's a lot of overlaps going on. There's a lot of overlaps. For example, you have the things going on during the Majapahit time. You have things going on during the Lakasuka time. You have all these things going on at the same time. And I think they have difficulties trying to separate all these influences. So they just say, okay, this is what happens this, and you just memorize whatever you pass the exams. But the way it's taught, then you don't really have a real feel, a real root, a real connection to your soil, to your country, to your people, to your history, to your culture. That's why we have this thing about, okay, now we are Muslims. We are good Muslims. Yeah, no, this is a comment.
Are you asking for questions or comments?
Yeah, we're
Yeah,
open.
so
But a question would be nice.
Yeah.
The question would be, how on earth are we supposed to have this real appreciation?
Okay.
This is one part of a culture, right? I mean, it's interesting that you could see the connections between what's being built in Java and what's built here and what's built in like 1,000 years ago, 800 years ago, and now. But how do we get people to understand that this is part of what we are and we have to keep this alive and we should embrace it?
I think that was a statement, so I agree with that.
I might be mistaken, but just now briefly you might have showed a slide of Polynesian. Could you elaborate on the similarities and if there happen to be any contact with in the Buddhist influence on their side as well?
That's the thing. So in the paper that I wrote, I talked about how, but of course this is the very unpopular structuralist way of attributing like act understanding of things. You know, like this is how one particular culture builds or understands particular forms. But let's say you put that aside. It's quite an interesting coincidence that this emphasis on enclosures with gates and then with mounds are also present among Polynesian groups who have no contact whatsoever with the Indic cultures of Southeast Asia. Of course, theirs will not have the specific ornamental systems and motifs that you see in the Indic world. But in Polynesian cultures, they also have a concept of a kind of temple. I mean, we have to use an English word for it, a kind of sacred ground, right? So in their sacred ground, they would have a gate, they would have a fenced area, and then they would have these elaborately terraced spaces and buildings. Yeah. And in some cases, graves are also terraced. So if you go to Tonga, for example, right, there's a Tu'i Tonga who will be buried in these terraced monuments. So I'm just saying that this notion of the terrace, the mound, as a space of the holy, is also present within. If you want to ask, okay, does it actually also belong within Malayo-Polynesian or Western Malayo-Polynesian culture? Well, it seems to. There's a shared kind of typology with the Polynesians who are doing that not because of any Indic influence of the Meru, but are doing it because of some autochthonous notion of holy space. That's all. I guess that's where I'm coming from. Also, if you know Micronesia, it's just west. Actually, it's not very far away from us. You know, Philippines, just to the east of it is Ponape and Kosrae. So there are these two places which are 11th century and 15th century. 11th century is contemporaneous with Melayu and Singosari, and no, Singosari, Kadiri. So and then 15th century will be contemporaneous with Malacca, but we have no contact with them. You know, this is a funny thing. They are just east of, but they are our cousins in terms of linguistic affiliation, Micronesian. So at that time, they were building these artificial islets made of basalt stone. Go and check it out. They created, so they live on tiny atolls, coral atolls, or on islands that have kind of like lagoons. And so they built up these artificial islands with gates and with little mounds, again raised mounds. And so it's fantastic. If you think of it from that kind of old-fashioned, now outdated structuralist perspective, that it does surprise you, like, hey, you know, so over there's some similarities with what is being done in the Indic monuments. That's all I'm saying. Yeah.
Okay. Do we have a last question?
Yes. Oh.
My question is, looking from the map, geographically what shows, certain part of southern Thailand, we can still find Malays there.
Yep.
Where they have similar cultural background and things like that. How come it's not mentioned, that portion of southern Thailand and also northeastern Malaysia or Malay? And like Kelantan, where they have stronger element or attributes in terms of arts and so on and so forth. Could you just provide some insight or comment on that?
Yeah, well, that will have to be another occasion because that's really a lot. So I just show a little bit of Terengganu saja. I didn't even go into, although I showed Patani and Kelantan, but it's not really the focus today. You're absolutely right. Actually, we cannot use the political boundary of Malaysia and Thailand to understand culture. Absolutely wrong. Because the Malay-speaking region goes all the way up to Trang. All the way up, that's Malay-speaking region, except that the people beyond Patani nowadays do not speak Malay anymore, or they speak a different dialect of Malay that is dying out. So there are many other linguistic factors, but in the past they did. So in the past, as late as the 19th and late 18th and early 19th century, I have another presentation on this, which I gave at Songkla. Where was I? Yes, as late as the 18th and early 19th, don't trust Malays on this, trust Chinese traders. Chinese traders write accounts that if you go here, people speak Malay. Simple. And then they say Malay kingdoms go all the way up to this one. Because they are traders, they write itineraries of where to trade, what products, and who is ruling there. Late 18th, early 19th. So actually, if you read the official histories, Thailand will always tell you, oh, this all Siam already. But if you listen to Chinese traders, they will tell you, nah, this one is still Malay. So yeah. It is true. And when you talk about architectural perspective, the mosques that you find in you see, Masjid Kampung Laut, which is found in Kota Baru, will distract us because it is in the form of the tiered roof. Actually, the form of the mosque in the northeast, that means Patani, Kelantan, Terengganu, and further north, is the hall form. Very similar to what you would understand today, but wrongly as Thai Wat, the Wat, the hall, the long hall. Now, Malay mosques from that part of the Malay-speaking region is usually the hall. So I have some photo, but I didn't show it today. Some of you will notice the Kota Baru original mosque is that form. Then there's this, still the surviving Teluk Manuk mosque, very, very famous, Teluk Manuk. Yeah, so it has a completely different trajectory. So actually, I don't know whether you noticed, in my title, I wrote Straits Malay. This is to qualify that that is another region. I did mention Pemele but just in passing, But yeah, really there is a different cultural realm when you talk about Patani. Yes. Yeah.
Okay, so I think yes, we have one more last question. Okay. So
just now you're saying that around 40 and Venezuela, they should not really acknowledge their past Buddhist and Hindu history. I'm just wondering, is it because of the lack of a significant monument? I mean, Java is like there's a chanty everywhere. Actually, it's like in Pulau Bujang. I'm from Kedah. I first went to Pulau Bujang like once, 2 years ago. I don't see it anywhere. So it's not in the.
Yeah, you're right. That's why I was making a jibe about that, because there's a lack of monuments. You're absolutely right. So even this is becoming a little bit monumental. Plus, in Indonesia, there is also the politics of Malayness versus Javanese-ness. You know about this Java centrism, huh? And so the Malays on Sumatra were like, yes, finally we can, Sriwijaya is older also, blah, 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 that kind of thing. So there is an added element. Maybe we rely on Kedahans to say, Kedah is older. I don't know. No, I'm kidding. But you're absolutely right. This is the lack of monumentality. Yeah, so unfortunately, people are attracted only by monuments for tourism. At least we know that we won't expect hordes of tourists going to Kedah very soon. No, there's no real answer to give you. Like, what am I supposed to say? Yeah, let's make it monumental. That will be the worst thing. Archaeologists will cry, They'll try to,
Okay, one last.
When you mentioned the term Kawi, where I understood it as Old Javanese, but you mentioned it as Old Malay.
Oh, yes. So if you read Kasparis and all that, they will tell you the Sumatran Kawi. So it seems that the kind of Kawi that we find on the Malay Peninsula is Sumatran Kawi, which is not surprising. Malacca rulers trace their descent, at least in terms of Sulalatu Salatin, they say they're from Palembang. So this Melayuness on the Straits seems to be across the Straits. Anyway, we can't say it's Sumatran. It is Sumatran and Peninsula on this side. All along it's been both sides. So that Kawi, Sumatran Kawi, is Sumatran plus Peninsula facing the Straits. Yeah. So there is also Sumatran Kawi, less heard about. Actually, if you listen to people like Peter Skilling and Arlo Griffiths, these are the two people who are at the forefront of researching on Sumatran inscriptions. So they are now starting to make it a little bit more well known. Previously, most people would have thought of inscriptions as coming from, these kinds of inscriptions are mostly
like in the popular imagination, Java. But now more and more are being discovered here. For me, from the Singapore perspective, it's interesting to at least try and one day look at that Singapore stone again that was blown to bits. We only have 3 small fragments like that. 3 fragments, 2 of which are in, one of which, or is it 2, are in Kolkata Museum. Yeah, I didn't even talk about that. I skipped that part just now.
Ahmad Anam, the author, the researcher, he said that when the Surata, I think, was written in Javanese Kawi.
Oh no, you meant not Suratusan, you meant the Sumatra Terengganu stone, right?
No, the Sejarah Melayu itself. Like he said, apparently the language they were written it was Kawi Java, not Kawi.
Suratu Salat?
Apparently that's his finding.
No, you meant Batu Bersurat Terengganu.
No. As in the Surata Salat. Like
No, Ahmad Adam does say that Batu Bersurat Terengganu is written full of Javanese words that have been misinterpreted by Alatas. And so, that far I know. But you're saying Sejarah Melayu, written in Kawi.
He said apparently the language that was used in that time was Kawi.
Oh, language. Hikayat Hang Tuah is full of Javanisms.
Right.
You cannot read Hikayat Hang Tuah without understanding Javanese. So, like I said, Majapahit time span like this, Malacca time span like that. A strong neighbor, and then Malacca trying to hold out against it. So a lot of but Malacca, if you read Hikayat Hang Tuah, if you take it as a document of Malacca era psyche, Hikayat Hang Tuah also talks about places like Vijayanagara, about Siam, about neighbors on the Straits, the Malay neighbors on the opposite side of the Straits, Sumatra kingdoms. So, where was I on this? Sorry, I forget. You're talking about the regional impact of Majapahit, for sure. So, who has written? Was it Hank Mayer? I can't remember. Somebody has written about this. The Javanisms that you get in Hikayat Hang Tuah, so heavy, and that reflects the fact that Hikayat, if we believe that this admiral, he is an admiral, I don't forget, Laksmana is admiral. If we believe his role was diplomacy across the seas, no surprise at all that a work on him would be so full of Javanisms. Because when the Portuguese conquered Malacca, they noted that people in Malacca, the vast majority, were Javanese. Javanese were the traders, they were also the main occupants. Utama Diraja was Javanese, there was Tuan Loskar or something like that, he was Javanese. So all the people appointed. So it's really not a surprise. Malacca, Kesultanan Malacca itself was very Javanese. And once you leave the Straits of Malacca, a lot of trade was in the hands of possessive Javanese. Javanese of the coast, right? Who spoke Malay, but for that matter. But they spoke Malay laced with Javanese. So there you go. Anyway, when you look at Peranakan Chinese, so-called Baba Malay, dia tak cakap ketam, dia cakap kepiting. Kepiting is Javanese, So many other things are Javanese because the stronger and longer-lived culture into which Chinese intermarried and adopted was not Malay, but possessive Javanese who spoke Malay. It's very complicated. Malacca was just a small port. Jawa, possessive Jawa, so many ports. You want to name Pati, Juana, Rembang, Demak, so many, Semarang, Surabaya, Gresik, Cirebon. These are all Javanese speaking. Melaka satu je yang the major one. So we are very myopic. We think diorang pasal diorang datang Melaka diorang jadi macam Melayu. Habis kepiting dia cakap. So they are actually longer lived as intermarried peoples on the Javanese coast. When Malacca was this new upstart, some migrated here. Itu saja. But of course we have the legend in that says that it's Hang Lipo and all that. So then it's like usually what people understand from these kinds of narratives is that it has to kind of find a legitimizing point to kind of write a narrative about why certain people exist in a particular way and why they belong there. So one way to draw the Peranakan Chinese of the Javanese coast into the Malaccan orbit is to create this story, origin myth almost, right? Macam, with Hang Lipo came in Zoraj, and then that we get the peoples who were Peranakan Chinese. But there are many complications about that. I wrote it in another piece. The earliest datable Chinese gravestone on Bukit China, for example, does not go back to the Malacca Sultanate. I mean, this one you can check on your own, the oldest dated. So we don't have firm evidence that people were actually settled and stayed. That's the difference between Peranakan and Chinese who went back to China. So Peranakan stayed on. So in the case of Malacca, the earliest datable Chinese Peranakan gravestone on Bukit China is not that old. It's 17th century. Yeah, correct, 17th century. We don't even have 16th or 15th century. Yeah, so, but Java, yes. So, I mean, sorry, we've kind of gone off tangent, but it's your fault.
So just very sort of like to keep in any session before everyone sort of like rush off to Wasa. If you're sort of really interested in our sort of pre-modern past, I think we're going to try to get sort of like England back in a few months' time. If you're willing to Ilhan Gallery, we can sort of like do it more. And incidentally, you also brought up like the guy who uses the LiDAR technology at YouTube, right? What's his name? Daniel, right? Is it
Daniel Perry.
Daniel, is it?
Very, yeah, but no, and then in Singapore it's another team, and then in Cambodia it's Apsara, so there's a lot of people involved in the LiDAR team, right?
I've heard Daniel speak before. So
Oh, you mean yeah, here in KL, definitely Daniel. No, I think you're talking about the American chap.
No, the Australian chap who runs
another one.
right.
Quite a few, yeah.
Yes. But anyway, that will be probably sometime in August or September, if you have time.
Thank you.
So come and join us. I think that's about it. Please join me.